Hello, kaiju lovers, and welcome to another episode of, I guess you could call it MIFV Live. This is going to the second entry in the what I'm calling the interview series that I've been doing, bringing on some cool people to see what they're doing in the kaiju and tokusatsu community. And with me today, I'll only back up really quick here. My first one, if you want to go back and listen to it, was with my friend, fellow podcaster, and an aspiring filmmaker, Elijah Thomas, which is pertinent for this because this guest has been previously interviewed by Elijah on his podcast, on his live stream, and it is none other than Dr. Jeffrey Engels. Welcome to MIFV.
Hi. Thanks for having me, Nate. It's really good to be here.
I am excited about this. Actually, I've been looking forward to it for a long time. So the big reason,
it's very kind of you.
Yeah. So to lay the groundwork here for those who don't know who you are, you gained a lot of notoriety very quickly in the Godzilla fandom. It feels like because you gave us this. Yeah, translations of the first two novelizations of right there. By Shigeru Kayama of Godzilla 1954 and Godzilla Raids Again. And you were kind enough to sign mine for me. I don't know how well that's showing up on there. Yeah, there we go.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And like I said, you kind of you had this a little bit of a meteoric rise. I heard you actually. I was aware of the book coming out for a while, and then I heard you interviewed on the Kaiju Transmissions podcast, and then I heard you interviewed by Elijah, like I mentioned, and that was the moment where, like, I got to get him on the show.
That's very sweet of you. I really appreciate it.
I was like, I got to get him on the show. And then I was like, oh my gosh, he's going to be at G-Fest? This is even better.
That's very nice of you. No, I mean, I love nothing more than geeking out about these things that I love with people who know as much, if not more, about it than I do. So that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Oh yeah, and like I said, I've been looking forward to this. I did read this, and to be honest, and this is something we'll get into, I think, over the course of this conversation. But as great as it was to read these translations, these novelizations, especially since I'm unfortunately, to let everybody know, Daniel DiManna of the Godzilla Novelization Project unfortunately will not be able to join us tonight. I may have to do a follow-up with the two of you here just to hear you talk about your different approaches to translating this work. But because Danny and his friend Robert Monsarrat did a fan translation of the first Kayama novelization using an Italian source, which is kind of interesting. So it's a translation of a translation. I would be curious to see how those would have, like you do a side-by-side comparison, how those would have turned out, because I'm sure something gets a little lost there a bit. I didn't even know that there was an Italian translation, to be honest, until Danny made me aware of it.
Yeah, it was interesting as I began to work on this, and I reached out to the agent who controls the Kayama, who controls the specs and access to it. He told me, "Oh yeah, there's an Italian." What, an Italian translation? So, and then there's also a French translation as well.
So French.
The English is the third translation to come out.
Yeah. Okay. Give me a second here. You were getting a little robotic there with the, as you were speaking. So, do I sound okay?
Yeah. Let me change my internet.
Okay, you're
settings
fine.
Here.
You're fine.
I think I might be able to fix that problem.
Okay. I will say you're sounding all right. All right for now, but definitely let me know. But anyway, I actually, to be honest, found your afterword, this essay you had in the back here, probably to be the most interesting thing in the entire book.
Oh, sorry. Are we okay right there?
Yeah. Did you hear what I said?
Good. I lost your last sentence there, but I think
okay. Yeah. I do think we have a little bit of lag going on here as well. We'll just have to, we'll do it live anyway. But I was saying, probably as great as the translation is, I actually found your afterward to be honestly the most interesting thing in the entire book. This very involved essay going into the whole process and giving background on the film and everything. And actually there was a fair
Yeah.
bit of information on the making of the film that I wasn't entirely aware of, and which I'm like, man, I
Oh.
wish I would have had that when I did my episode on this movie a couple years ago.
Nice. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So, I'm not quite sure exactly for the reasons behind this, but Kayama, the science fiction writer who was involved with the first draft of the script, he kind of seems to have been left out a lot of the discussion in English about the creation of the movie. And so, when I was diving into this novelization, I found a whole bunch of other essays which were written by him about his involvement with Godzilla, and so there was all kinds of like, valuable and fascinating information in there that I thought, wow, kaiju lovers out there need to know this. So
Hmm.
so that was my inspiration for the afterword. And I have to admit that writing the afterword was as much fun for me as translating the story itself.
Mhm, mhm. I'm pretty sure it's been a while since I've listened to the episode that I did on it, but I'm pretty sure I did mention him, at least in
Good,
passing. Like, yeah,
good.
he did the story treatment, but then it was picked up by another screenwriter who did the actual final shooting script and all of that. And I
Yeah.
did mention that he was a science fiction author, but I honestly didn't know a whole lot beyond that. So, he got some lip service, but it was actually, your book that really opened my eyes to
Oh,
to this
thanks.
man.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I mean, he's a really fascinating writer. And one of the reasons I kind of got interested in him was because I had written my dissertation about a writer who Kayama himself loved, and
Ooh.
later on, it was that writer who I wrote my dissertation about that helped to incubate Kayama as a young writer. Kayama started off his career about I forget the exact year off the top of my head, but it was around 1950, maybe a little bit later. And he submitted his first story to a magazine which was controlled by the writer Edogawa Rampo. It was a magazine called Hoseki, usually
Hmm.
translated as the Jewel, and it was they were having a contest for new writers, and so there was something like 200 submissions and 7 winners, and Kayama was one of them. And he had written this like really kind of wild and bizarre story about adventurers, heading out to Indonesia and discovering a new variety of human being, a tiny little human being, a cryptid that was living out in the wilds of Indonesia. And so anyway, that was his career, but he started publishing so much that like within just a couple of years, he was just publishing enormous amounts of writing. I don't even understand how one person could do as much writing as he did. So it was kind of right at that moment that that the people at Toho Studios found him. So
Mm,
yeah,
mhm.
so it's right at the beginning of his meteoric rise in the world of
Yeah.
science fiction.
Yeah, that's interesting because if I remember correctly, the there was a failed project that I think was actually supposed to be filmed in Indonesia that eventually became Godzilla. So that's an
That's
interesting parallel there. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
because it fell
It's true.
through, and then Tomoyuki Tanaka is like, "Oh, we need something to fill it up," so we'll go with that. But actually,
Exactly. Yeah.
I just realized, we're already jumping into the kind of the meat and
Ooh.
potatoes of our conversation. But one thing that I wanted to make sure I asked. I mean, I told you why I have you on the show and why you've been getting a lot of attention in the Godzilla community. Got you a guest spot at G Fest, which was really excited for me because we had been corresponding a little bit. And
Yeah.
then I'm like, "Oh, you're going to be at G Fest. I could actually meet you in person. This will be exciting." And then what? And
Thank
then I
you.
was surprised to find out that we actually don't live that far from each other. It's only a couple of hours because you live up in, what is it, Ann Arbor?
No, I live in Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Kalamazoo. That's right.
So
Okay.
yeah.
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 Kalamazoo. I'm sorry. I'm getting all these Michigan cities mixed up here.
It's all good.
Yeah. Yeah. And I live in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So it's maybe only a couple of
Nice.
hours. But then,
Yeah, that's not far at all.
yeah. So again, besides your work on this, what else can we know about
Uh,
Dr. Angles?
gosh, let's see. Uh, where should I
Wait,
start?
I was to say you're a professor.
Yeah, that's right. So I teach Japanese literature at Western Michigan University.
Mhm.
Yeah, I first went to Japan when I was 15 years old, and
Ooh.
it kind of started my love affair with Japan. I was really lucky to go. Like, I was this American Midwestern kid who had hardly ever
Mhm.
been outside of the Midwest, and then I went to this relatively small fishing town in southwestern Japan, and it was just like, super exciting. So that got me started. I love to read,
Mhm.
not just monster stories,
Mhm.
but I love literature of all types and
Mhm.
stripes. I've done a lot of work in the past. I've done a lot of translation along the way.
Mhm.
A lot of it has been of poetry, because poetry is
Ah,
one of the
okay.
least translated aspects of Japanese literature.
I was gonna say it would be
And
difficult to translate poetry because there's
it,
I mean, I took a couple of poetry classes as a
uh-huh,
master's student. Two
uh-huh,
that were basically lit classes, and then one that was actually about writing it because it was something I wanted to do
mhm,
to really stretch myself. And I can tell you that the the rhythm and composition of poetry is very a lot can be lost when you translate it from one language to another because
yeah,
certain poetic forms,
mhm,
that you can use in English and they can work in other languages, but something gets lost a little bit. So
absolutely,
I don't envy
absolutely.
you trying to do that. Yeah.
I don't know. I think I like impossible and crazy challenges. So,
Mhm. Oh,
but yeah,
which is a great attitude to have, actually.
yeah. No, I mean, one of the great discoveries of being in the world of Japanese literature is that there are so many good books. There are so
Mhm.
many, and 99% of all the books that come out in Japan aren't translated. So, there's
Mhm.
so much to do. So in the last few years in my career, well, maybe the last 10 years or so, I've been kind of like, combing through Japanese literature and finding, some of these
Mhm.
wonderful treasures, including Godzilla,
Yeah,
which,
yeah, there
had
you go.
somehow flown under the radar. So, when I
Yeah.
realized that this book was out there, like, I was a Godzilla fan since I was a kid, and but I didn't know that there was a book out there. And when I realized that there was a book out there, I was like, oh my god, why has no one ever
Mhm.
translated this? This is insane. So yeah, I just decided to do it. And compared to the translation of poetry, translating this was so fun. And I don't want to say it was easy, because it wasn't exactly easy, but so much of the text is very concrete.
Mhm.
Godzilla is attacking a city. He's stomping on things and people, and
Mhm.
there are descriptions of those things. So it's relatively easy to imagine as you read it. So in a
Right.
way, I didn't have all the same problems that I had with with translating poetry, where sometimes things are very abstract. But
Oh,
anyway,
yeah.
this has been great fun.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I
So you teach Japanese literature. You said you did your was it your doctoral dissertation on a Japanese author?
Yeah. So the whole way along, I did a master's degree in Japanese literature and then a PhD in
Mhm.
Japanese literature. Yeah.
I was wondering, as someone who's, you can check this off your bingo card, people, me name dropping that I have a master's degree. It's a little bit of a joke, but but
Oh, no,
I was
no,
just,
that's very
oh yeah,
respectable.
yeah. But it's like I said, it's just it's a funny thing that all of my friends, we all tease each other. We have like
Mm,
bingo
mm.
cards. We you say or do this on the on the air. And well, apparently one of mine is mentioning I
Oh.
have a master's degree. But yeah, I was just curious because I'm like, I don't know of any colleges that offer degrees in Japanese literature. And I will admit, that would have been very tempting for me if any of the ones
Yeah.
around here had offered that, or if I would have just settled for a class on Japanese. I would have jumped at it. Like, I remember one of the classes I was going to take that ended up getting canceled because there weren't enough people who signed up, but it was an actual master's level class. It was going to be on horror films.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
was bound and determined. I'm like, I hope they let us just pick one and do like an end of semester paper on it because I got one about killer mushrooms that I need to tell people about.
Matango, ne? I
Yes,
love it.
Matango. Yeah, and
Right.
I probably would have pitched it to the professor teaching. Is like, so I wanted to do a Japanese horror movie from the '60s. Oh, what's that? Well, it's
No.
gonna sound I'm gonna sound insane if I tell you what it's about, but
That book, that novel. There is a novel for Matango that was a novel first before it was a
Mhm.
film. Yeah, that's I've got my eye on that novel, and
Oh wait, an
I,
actual not the short story by
well,
William Hope Hodgson.
right. So Hodgson wrote a story. What was it called in English? I forget.
A Voice in the
Voices.
Night.
Voice of the Night. That's right. That's right. So that was the inspiration, and then a Japanese writer by the name of Fukushima. That's his last name. Fukushima Masami wrote a kind of modernized Japanese adaptation of that story, and then that became the basis for Matango the film. So there was this kind of intermediary Japanese version of it, and it's right here in this book. Ooh.
Ooh, I was
So
gonna say I need this in my life now.
I know, and you're not the only one too. I want to bring it out. So yeah, there's a certain press out there. I can't mention their name yet because they haven't said yes officially, but there's a certain press out there that I'm trying to tempt with a big collection of kaiju related stories, and this is one that I
Oh.
propose needs to be in there. So
Oh,
yeah,
that'll be a day one
I'm
purchase for me.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because the story of Matango. Oh, sorry, I hope I'm not getting off
No,
track
no, no,
here.
no, no, that's
I get
fine.
excited and nerdy about these things, but Matango, like it was such a strange movie, about killer mushrooms, right? That a number of other writers, including a very famous writer by the name of Osamu Hashimoto, wrote a sequel to it, and then he wrote a sequel to his sequel. And just a few years ago, there was an entirely another person who wrote a very, very, very long sequel that's like 400 or 500 pages. I just bought it when it was in Japan the other day.
Oh my
So
gosh,
yeah,
I did not know any of this, and I
so
am psyched right now. Like I made a list of potential literary works that have connection either because they're novelizations or they were inspirations for Japanese film that I wanted us to talk about a little bit. A lot of them I will admit I haven't read yet. They're on my list, and some haven't been translated yet, but but I wanted to
Mhm.
bring them up because I figured you would be
uh,
familiar with them. Maybe I hope anyway. And so yeah, the fact that I'm learning about this right now about Matango has me psyched.
yeah.
I hope Danny, if you're listening to this, please leave a comment in the chat about this because I didn't know. And there's a particular connection with Matango because because I do these kind of audio drama segments that are like funny characters who show up on the podcast,
Mhm.
and Danny plays one of them. He's this mad scientist character who was actually inspired by Matango. And
Ooh.
a new thing I started doing a couple of years ago as like a little Halloween special is,
Uh-huh.
and it's styled like a horror anthology show. Like there's a host who introduces, and then somebody reads a short story that's related to one of a scary short story that's related to one of the movies that I've covered. Well, the first year I did it, it was A Voice in the Night by William Hope Hodgson, and I had Danny read it as his mad scientist character, and it's actually one of my favorite
Ooh.
things that I've ever done on the podcast. And Danny's reading and his performance is just brilliant.
Oh, I'm gonna have to check that out. That sounds
Oh,
fun.
yeah, I'll send you a link. But now that I know that there's even more, I feel like I may have come across that at some point, but I might have disregarded it because I thought somebody wasn't quite getting the information correct. Because I think they didn't even mention an author. I think they just said, "Oh, there was a novel." I'm like, "Do you mean the short story?" And
Yeah.
so I may
It
have
was
disregarded it.
fascinating. Yeah, no, it's fascinating to realize it's such a weird movie. There's like a whole little body of literature that grew up around it. So, yeah, it's fascinating. I found out about
I'm not
Matango
surprised.
a number of years ago from a Japanese poet friend of mine. I hadn't seen it until maybe 10 years ago or something, and we're sitting around talking about movies that really scared us when we were children. And she
Mhm,
told me about how that movie had given her nightmares for years,
mhm.
and so I'm like, "Ooh, I have to see it." And
Yeah,
there we
it's
go.
very
I fell in love.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's very psychological, which is something that I really appreciate. I know some people might, even Tokusatsu fans, might look at it now and think the effects are kind of quaint point, but I'm like, but the atmosphere and the performances and the writing just really sell that, and
Mhm.
I would be curious to know what the book is like. The screenwriter was Takashi Kimura, aka Karu Mabuchi, and he was a really dour guy, but he was a brilliant screenwriter, and he considered Matango to be his masterpiece. So now I'm like,
Oh,
I gotta know what goes on in the book now, especially
yeah,
since
yeah.
one of the characters is a writer, and I'm like, man, I would love to. Is the writer character? I know we're a little off track, but is the writer character in the novel?
So yeah, so the characters, it's been a bit since I've read it, but the writing aspect of it is there, but I don't think it's like really kind of at the forefront of it.
Okay,
It's just sort of mentioned in passing. But
okay.
yeah, yeah, it's I wonder how much the writer might have identified with that character. It's hard
I
to say.
really wonder too. And when was it published?
Ooh, gosh, I don't know the exact year off the top of my head, but
Yeah, the movie was in
yeah.
'63.
Let's see. I might be able to find it right here.
I'm just curious because
Yeah.
once I figured out that the movie actually predates Gilligan's Island and how freakishly similar the cast of characters are, I'm
Uh-huh.
like, what is going on here? Because Matango is kind of a dark Gilligan's Island.
Oh, right, right. Sorry, I don't have the date right on my fingertips
Yeah.
here, and I
Well,
don't
it
see it
just
in
has
the
it
text
has to be
itself, but
it has to be before '63. That's all. Yeah. But wow, that is so cool. Thank you.
yeah. Sure, sure, sure.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But anyway. So yeah, you hinted at it a little bit, but how did you said you were a Godzilla fan from a young age. So how did you discover Godzilla,
Uh,
Tokusatsu, all of that stuff?
yeah, so my Godzilla origin story was a little bit like I think a lot of people. I'm not sure how unique it is. I caught some of the Godzilla movies on reruns on the weekends. And, like lots of kids, I enjoyed stomping on shoe boxes, pretending like I was Godzilla stomping on Tokyo.
Mhm.
And that was a fun game that my friends and I used to like to
Mhm.
play when we were like 7 and 8 years old.
Mhm.
But, as I grew up, I kind of, honestly, I left those things aside for a little
Mhm.
while. And, as I began to do my studies in Japanese literature, I didn't go in the kaiju direction at all, but I have a great love for adventure stories. I have a great love for ghost stories in particular.
Mm.
I love all sorts of things like that. I love monsters, but it was only fairly recently that I kind of came back to kaiju, and realized that there was actually all this kind of kaiju literature connection. Um, it was during the pandemic that actually
Mm.
that happened. Just right before the pandemic, I was teaching a class called like Disaster in Modern Japan, and I was having like all the students and read all these very serious, tragic things about you know uh, big tragedies or earthquakes, the 1923 earthquake that destroyed Tokyo and Yokohama, the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and Fukushima meltdown. I was having them read all these serious things, and so I decided to stick Godzilla in the syllabus, partly as a way to kind of, like partly as a way to reflect upon how Japan has reflected upon disasters in its cultural imagination, right? And it was only kind of really then when I was showing it to the students that I really thought, gosh, there's so much meat here. There's so much to be said about this. And as I was showing it to my students and its titles were scrolling by, the very first title that appears in Godzilla 1954 is the producer's name, Tomoyuki Tanaka, and then the second name that comes out is this author's name, Shigeru Kayama. And I thought, and it said, Gensaku, Kayama Shigeru, like based on the work of Shigeru Kayama. And I thought, wait, what? Based on the work of him? I, I recognize his name, but I didn't realize that it was that I thought began to think, well, what is the work that this is based on? And so
Mhm.
it took me all of about like 1 minute of internet research to find out, that these books are out there. in Japan. They've been reprinted multiple times over the years from different publishers, and the most common edition is this one, which is out
Hmm.
right now. I think you can pick this up in any big Japanese bookstore. It's not an unusual book. It's not hard to find at all, and it's so immediately the next time I went to Japan, I picked up a copy of it and devoured it like within 2 days or whatever.
Hmm.
And I just thought, oh my god, this is just such a neat opportunity.
Hmm.
And so this is my fun pandemic project,
Hmm.
to motivate myself and give me a reason to wake up in the morning when during the
Hmm.
pandemic it didn't seem like there's a lot of reason to
Yeah.
wake up.
Woo.
So this is what kept me going during the pandemic. And so it was only last year, 2003, that it reached the book stands. And yeah, I couldn't have been more thrilled about how um, how
Mhm.
how much attention it got.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
In fact, one thing I should also mention because it is available on the MIFV YouTube channel, but you and I got to panel about the original film, and
yeah,
at G Fest, and you got to talk about Kayama's work and how it related to the movie and the pre-production and things like that. Was such a stacked panel. It was you, me, Danny,
that
and Elijah. Oh, and
that was
Kevin
a
Horn.
blast. Yeah, that
Yeah,
was a blast. You guys are wonderful. So
yeah.
yeah, I could have asked for better conversationalists.
Oh, I was gonna say that was my favorite panel of the to be on anyway of the entire weekend, you know.
Nice.
But yeah, and there were a lot of good panels this year at G Fest. But that it's interesting that you bring that up. But one of the things that before we start getting into the book itself, because I know that's a big
Mhm,
draw, but I kind of want to lay a little bit of a groundwork here, and we've already
mhm,
gotten into it a little bit, but and I know it'd be hard to crystallize this into a relatively short conversation, but I will confess, growing up in America, I took a lot of lit classes, but the vast majority of my literature classes focused on American and British literature with a little bit of, some smatterings of like the classics, the,
mhm,
Homer and things like that. Very Western
mhm.
focused, but a lot of it's American and British. I don't know a whole lot about Japanese literature. Despite loving things from Japan, whether it's anime, tokusatsu, or whatever, I don't know
Mhm.
a whole lot. And comic books, manga, I don't know a lot about Japanese literature. So
Mm.
I'm just trying to think. What was the literary scene like in Japan leading up to the creation of this book?
Yeah. Ooh, boy. How
I
much
know it's a
detail
big
should I get
question. I'm
into?
not it's a big question, but I'm like, I wanna talk
Yeah.
about that, but I don't know how to crystallize that into, a quick question, but it's probably not gonna be quick.
Yeah. No, no, no. That's an amazing question. Um, so let me back up and just give a little bit of history here. So before Japan's kind of slipped into the sort of very aggressive military phase of World War II,
Mhm,
that kind of started around 1937 with the
mhm,
Marco Polo incident in Manchuria.
mhm,
That was kind of the thing that kicked off the Japanese full-scale invasion of China.
mhm,
And once that happened, the Japan had a thriving, super dynamic literary scene up till that point. Like the literature of the 1920s and 30s is hands down fantastic.
mhm,
It's really just so full of imagination and creativity. There was an explosion in the 1920s and 1930s of magazines.
mhm,
So the numbers of magazines that existed in Japan between around 1915 and 1930, I forget the exact year, they quadrupled the number of magazines that existed. So what that meant is that there were there were all kinds of forums everywhere suddenly for writers, aspiring writers to write and to publish, and it created this environment where there was just this dynamic, wonderful energy, and people were writing in all sorts of styles, all sorts of methods, using like very avant-garde stuff, writing children's adventure stories, everything under the sun. But then, as the Japan slipped after 1937 into the to the aggressive phase of the militarist expansion, the Japanese government became much more censorial. It began to really censor things that were kind of in quotes frivolous and things that did not sort of support the war effort. And there was a lot of authors who felt like, why should I write like, patriotic nationalist bullshit? And
Mhm.
so, that wasn't a good time for writers from 1937 to 1945. And as the war got worse, especially after 1941 and the entry of the U.S. into the Pacific War, the censorship got incredibly strict. And so from about like 1941 to 1945, um, that censorship combined with the fact that as the war went on, there were more and more paper shortages, meant that there was less and less stuff being published. So when 1945 came, the war ended, the Japanese population was starving for good literature. They were starving for good things to read. And so it took Japan a while to get back on its feet. It took a while for the publishing industry to get back on its feet. It took a while to clear up the paper shortages that were created by World War II. And so it's really only about 1950 that the publishing industry was kind of back. And so around 1950, there was this huge dynamism. Like there was so much literature being produced because people were hungry for new stuff. They had
Mhm.
been denied it for the years 1937 to 1945. And
Mhm.
so by the time that the publishing industry was fully back around 1950, people were like, please, please, more books,
Mhm.
more books.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And it was a really great time for literature. And so
Mhm.
lots of new magazines were created, including the magazine Hoseki or The Jewel, which where Kayama made his debut.
Mhm.
So Kayama was like very much one of these people who saw the post-war revival of the literature scene as a great opportunity. With that first short story that he submitted to the Jewel, he won the contest. His work was published, and he immediately quit his job. he's like, I'm leaving this place. He was working for the Japanese Ministry of Finance, so he was working for the Japanese government in their economics bureau. He had done his college degree in economics, so
Mm.
um, so this is but he was a massive lover of paleontology.
Ah.
He loved dinosaurs. He loved, paleontology. He loved cryptids. He loved
Mhm.
all these stories about adventure and creatures living out in
Mhm.
odd corners of the world. So and so he that's what he decided to pursue,
Mhm.
and that's basically what gave us Godzilla. It was
Mhm.
him and these in his passionate interest in paleontology. He came along at just the right time, at just the right moment in literary
Mhm.
history, and was just publishing like crazy in the year 1954 when Tanaka came and tapped him to
Mhm.
write or the scenario for Godzilla. So
Wow.
when
I
Tanaka like tapped him, I guess Tanaka had a kind of vague idea. We want to do a
Mhm.
story about a radioactive monster, but give us a story. And so Kayama really was the one who came up with all the contours of the Godzilla story. You know, yes, people at the studios massaged his script and kind of turned it into the film that we know now. There's quite a lot of changes that were made, but he more or less came up with the general outlines of the entire story. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's just the right guy at the right place at the right time.
Oh, for sure. I feel like I'm back in school again. I'm like, I have so many follow-up questions. So, because
Sorry, I don't mean to. to
no, yeah, well, yeah,
yeah.
because see, that's all fascinating to me. So I'm just thinking of, going back to, what I know of American and British literature, I know that the 19th century is considered a peak time for British literature.
Mhm.
That's when you have the likes of Dickens and, even authors like the author of Treasure Island as
Oh yeah, yeah.
wow, I need to turn in
Stevenson.
my card. Stevenson, the likes of them, the Victorian era is this, is
Yeah.
this peak time. American literature wasn't quite there, at least in the critical circles, but then it seems like when you get to that, intermediary time between the world wars, that's when American
Mhm,
literature really starts coming into its own with
mhm,
Hemingway and The Grapes of Wrath and these The Great Gatsby, these
uh-huh,
very important pieces of American
yeah.
literature. What was that like? What era was that for Japan? Was it the 20s and 30s? Was it a little bit sooner?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and the answer might depend a little bit on who you ask.
Mm.
But one of the things that's really great about studying Japanese literature is Japan has this unbelievable literary history.
Mhm.
People have been writing books in Japan since the 700s. The
Mhm.
first book written in Japanese was in the late 700s, 780. I forget the exact year off the top of my head. But so there's a long tradition, and Japan is a very, very, very literate society. It had in the 18th and 19th centuries a very high literacy rate compared to other countries around the world.
Mm.
So that meant that there was an enormous amount of literature produced in Japan. But once Japan began to open up to the West, that happened in the 1850s and 1860s. After Japan opened up to the West, there was a flood of new ideas coming in from the West, new types of literature that they'd never seen. So there was one kind of golden age of Japanese literature that emerged relatively soon after that, when writers who were kind of like coming out of the Japanese literary tradition were looking at these Western works and thinking, "Wow, what can we do? Like how can we take Japanese literature in new directions?" And so there was this spectacular era around maybe 1880 to maybe 1910, when there was an era of incredible growth as people were figuring out how to make a new Japanese literature. So that's kind of one phase. But then around by the time you reach like World War One, in the 1910s, Japan had come of age as a nation. It was now a modernized nation. Now it had an economy that was right up there neck and neck with some of the major economies of the West, and their art was very sophisticated. Like the Japanese were as up on the newest things happening in Europe as the Europeans were. And so there's another, like after 1910, 1920s, 1930s, kind of before the slide into militarism, there was another kind of second phase of that wonderful moment in Japanese history where now the Japanese authors were as advanced as and creative and up on kind of international trends as any author anywhere in the world. And so there was a new kind of very cosmopolitan, wonderful literature that was written during that time. I'm a little bit biased because like so many of the authors that I've worked on and really loved were from that time. Like the
Mhm.
1920s and 30s is endlessly fascinating to me
Mhm.
because of what I said before, like this huge explosion in the number of magazines that existed, and just the sheer creativity, knowledge about the world, and brilliance of so many different writers.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, during the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, there weren't many people who were translating Japanese literature into English yet. So, it Japanese literature didn't get known until basically after World War II. It was really kind of in the 1960s and 1970s that we began to get the first big waves of Japanese literary translations into English. So
Was that
um,
was it Mishima? Was he a big part of that?
he was there's a writer who you named Yukio Mishima,
Mhm.
who's sometimes called one of the big three of the mid 20th
Yeah,
century.
yeah, yeah, I have not read any of
Yeah.
his books, however, I did see the film that was made about him, what was it, in the
Oh,
80s?
yes,
Yeah,
right. Directed by
Mishima,
Paul
what was it?
Fraser. A
What
Life
was it?
in Four
Oh,
Chapters.
Life in 4 Chapters, that's what it was, yeah.
One of the most visionary, brilliant films I've ever seen. Totally incredible.
Mhm.
If I can just make a shameless little plug here, I've just
No, go
translated.
for it. We love shameless
translated
self-promotion around here.
Yay! I've just translated some Mishima, and it's going to be coming out from
Oh.
Penguin Classics relatively soon. It's in a book called Voices of the Fallen Heroes, and it's a
Mm,
collection of short stories by Mishima that had been ignored up until recently, and
mhm,
so I did some of the translation in there. It's a
mhm.
collection by a bunch of different translators, but yeah, Mishima's great. I have a love-hate relationship with Mishima personally. He's so brilliant,
Mhm.
and sometimes he's so self-involved. But
Yes,
when he's
yeah,
when he's
I got that
brilliant,
impression
incredible.
watching the film and the I've done some research on it because he had a very famous ending, shall we say? Basically, to put it
Yes.
succinctly, for those who don't know, he was a brilliant literary author in Japan for, I think, what was it? It was mostly the 50s and 60s, correct?
Hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And
Yep.
then in the early 70s, because he had revolutionary tendencies, shall we say, and attempted a coup in the early
Yeah.
70s.
Yeah.
And his goal was I can't it was basically was it to capture or kill the prime minister? I can't remember.
Yeah, no, he was I think the goal was to capture him
Yeah.
and to hopefully, you
Yeah.
know, make
Yeah.
things change from there.
Right,
And like
right.
you
He
said,
wasn't able to do that, and then before the authorities could get in there and arrest him, he like a samurai committed seppuku. So,
yeah,
yeah,
in the
he had a
traditional way.
very he had a very notorious ending, and the film chronicles that.
Mhm.
I think it's, if I remember correctly, I think it actually starts in the kind of in media res with that, and then I think it's flashbacks.
Mhm.
Is it flashbacks? I could be wrong on that. It's been a hot minute since I saw the
Oh
movie.
boy. Yeah, yeah, it's probably been more than a decade for me, so I can't quite
Yeah.
remember the where
Yeah,
things fall in there, but
but it does dramatize the lead up
mhm.
to when,
Yes.
the coup, and then the attempted
Yeah.
coup, and and then his
Yeah.
death. So, anyway,
Yeah.
so Mishima's
It
a big deal in Japanese
is a
literature.
big, big deal, and partly because, he had this very, very weird ending, as you said. Like, I mean,
Mhm.
for a long time, actually, in Japan, he was sort of discredited by that. People thought like, "Oh my god, the guy, what the hell was he even thinking?"
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I
but
think even
if I
even when he was actually publishing before he died, I mean, he had for what I understand, he had a tendency to annoy people.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Since we're here to talk about kaiju, I might just
Yeah.
add there is a little Mishima connection with
Mhm.
kaiju. He was a huge fan of Godzilla. When he saw
Ah,
Godzilla 1954, he went around and he said, I haven't seen such an interesting film in a very long time. So
interesting. Mm.
yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, he didn't write about Godzilla, but it's very well documented that he
Mm.
said this to many people. But he had
Wow.
lots of praise for this movie.
That is really interesting. So, I do recommend, go check out Mishima Life in Four
Yeah,
Chapters. That's a
yeah,
good kind of primer on him. And then if that
yeah,
interests you,
yeah,
go check out the books, including the ones
yeah,
that Dr. Engels is
yeah,
working on for us. So,
yeah.
yeah.
If I can just plug one more book,
Oh, go for
there's
it.
what his debut novel was a book called The Confessions of a Mask.
Mhm.
Kame no Kokuhaku in Japanese, and it's one of the most beautiful and powerful gay kind of like sort of self-identification. It's not exactly a coming out story, but it's a tremendously, tremendously powerful piece of work.
Mhm.
And it seems to be related to Mishima's own feelings and
Mhm.
conflicts about his own sexual desires.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, yeah,
it's I think one of the most, it's a classic of Japanese gay literature.
yeah, yeah, because that's one of the things that made him pretty countercultural at the time.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. But anyway, so you're talking about all this, and I know in other interviews that I've heard you do when you've talked about Kayama, I think,
Mhm.
did you describe Kayama as being more of what Westerners might term a pulp writer?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Kayama, who wrote Godzilla and worked on the first draft of the script, yeah, he was writing for very popular forums, not necessarily kind of what people might call high literature. I
Mhm.
put that in air quotes here because I honestly don't think any distinction between high literature and popular literature is completely artificial. But, he was writing for more magazines that had, like, readerships of, adolescents, especially a lot of male readers, so I think that, yeah, yeah, I mean, he was kind of aiming for a popular audience, and when he wrote, Godzilla, he published the novels of Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again, about the same time that, Godzilla Raids Again reached the theaters.
Mhm.
So in 1955, mid-1955, he published the books, and when he rewrote when he wrote this novel, when he kind of rewrote his scenario as a novel, he was definitely aiming for a young adult audience. So
Mhm.
He wasn't necessarily aiming to reach the literati and so on.
Hmm.
And he had a very he approached Godzilla very much as a an anti-nuclear fable. And so he really wanted to reach a young generation who was going to inherit the future of Japan and send the message, how terrible and horrifying hydrogen bombs are, how
Hmm.
terrible radiation is, and how radiation can screw up everybody's lives if it's
Hmm.
brought,
Hmm.
on land. So
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, actually, sometimes when you're saying that the distinction is artificial, sometimes what separates it is just time. When
yeah,
Dickens was writing for magazines and serializing books, he was the popular literature of his day, and now he's considered high literature, and everybody has to read him in
right,
high school.
right, right. Yeah,
So yeah, like I said, sometimes it's just going to be all that matters is time. So
that's right.
to go back to, kind of what was running parallel in America at the time. So the 20s and 30s was kind of the prime time of like the pulp magazines. And, so was
Mm,
there anything, like that in Japan, or was
yeah.
there no real distinction?
No, no, there were definitely, kind of pulpy magazines and popular magazines.
Mhm.
Yeah, they definitely were out there, and there were a lot of them.
Mhm.
Once, and, they ranged from the very kind of erotic, sort of
Mhm.
sexy stories that, might entice, readers,
Mhm.
to very, to like kids writing, also there were all sorts of kind of popular uh, types of writing, and some of which were very pulpy, some of which were printed on very poor quality paper,
Mhm. Well,
so that
that's
it
where
produced
that's
cheaply.
where, they got the name actually, at least in America,
Right.
is because they were
Yeah.
printed on low grade paper that was made by
Right.
from quote unquote paper pulp, basically.
Right.
And that's why they called them pulp magazines.
Yeah.
And they were generally considered to be, kind of the lowbrow popular fiction of their day. But
Right.
then there were a lot of seminal authors who came out of that. H.P. Lovecraft, the
Lovecraft. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and the or not I am such a terrible nerd right now. It's the guy who wrote Conan. He was friends with H.P. Lovecraft. The Robert E. Howard. Robert E. Howard.
There we go.
So a lot of big names that still came out of that. I was just curious because it sounds like there's
Yeah.
some similar developments kind of going on
Absolutely.
in Japan and
Absolutely.
America at the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So the magazine where Kayama made his debut that I've already mentioned a couple of times,
Hmm.
Hoseki or The Jewel,
Hmm.
I think that probably, I mean, yeah, it wasn't printed on super low quality paper, but it was definitely one of those magazines that was aiming for a very popular, broad audience, and it didn't have like sort of very arrogant literary aspirations. It was
Right.
definitely like a magazine for the people. So
Right. So I don't remember if you've brought this up in previous interviews or not, but it's a question that came to my mind. So we're talking about 1950, and the literary scene is coming back in Japan and things like that. That's also still in the middle of the occupation, and I know there was a lot of censorship from the occupation government, particularly with film and journalism. Was that affecting the literary scene as well?
yes, yes. The occupation of Japan started in 1945 with the end of World War II
Mhm.
and ended in 1952. So it
Mhm.
wasn't, it was only 7 years approximately. It wasn't the longest, occupation in the world.
Mhm.
But during that time, there were a couple of things that were censored very heavily by the American occupying forces, and really, their censorship tended to focus on two particular areas. One of them was discussions about fraternization between
Mhm.
American GIs and Japanese
Yes.
prostitutes.
Yes.
People thought that if there was discussion of this in the press, in novels, in film, or whatever, that could help prejudice the Japanese population against the Americans, when in a time, it was really kind of desperate that we make up and become friends. So that was controlled very heavily. And the other thing that was controlled very heavily was discussions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the legacies of those two places. And the reason, I mean, that sounds a little bit shocking today, but the reason for that was, I think the Americans were terribly frightened that if sort of all the pictures that we now have seen from Hiroshima were to get out to the Japanese public, um, it would be so shocking to the Japanese public that it actually might turn the tide of opinion against the Americans. So it wasn't possible to even see a picture of Hiroshima and Nagasaki until the Americans left. And so that meant, I mean, yes, everyone in Japan knew about the atomic bomb, but actually seeing it and kind of knowing about it or hearing about it are two very different things, right?
Hmm.
The pictures that came out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are so stomach turning, horrible, and just gut wrenching that that they felt like that couldn't be something that the Japanese population saw.
Mm.
I encountered this. I don't. Sorry if I'm getting off topic here, but my brain is just stuff filled with like useless facts here. But there's a really great Japanese poet by the name of Rin Ishigaki, and she is one of the most famous, post-war poets of Japan. She was working in the newspaper office during the 1950s, and that was about the time that the occupation had just ended, the censorship had been lifted, and now it was okay to publish basically anything as long as it wasn't super sexually explicit. There still are there were still rules about erotic stuff and censorship of that. You could basically publish anything except super, super erotic material in the 1950s. And so she was asked by her newspaper editor to look at some of these brand new pictures of Hiroshima that were coming out and to write something about them. And so she wrote that she was so stunned by the images that she saw of Hiroshima that she just didn't even, there were no words. She said that she broke down weeping, and it just was like an unforgettable experience for her to see these pictures for the first time. So anyway, so to make a sorry, getting into
No, no, it's all right.
getting into the weeds here, but yeah, my point is that like basically open discussions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't really possible until after the occupation ended, and that was in 1952. So when Godzilla came along in 1954, discussions about radiation and its legacy, and how that can affect people, were still relatively new in Japan. So there hadn't been, uh, while people did know about Hiroshima, while they did know about Nagasaki, um, even the emperor alluded to that in his speech to the Japanese nation when he said we're going to surrender.
Hmm.
People knew about it, but they hadn't seen it, and so like the kind of visual representations of radiation weren't there until
Hmm.
almost just like moments before before Godzilla came to theaters.
Hmm. I know that there was a film. I think I can't remember. It was either in 52 right after the occupation or in 53. It was called Children of Hiroshima, and I think
Oh yeah, 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 yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
credited as being one of the first films to
Right.
tackle the subject. So
It's a great, great film.
Godzilla wasn't first in that regard, but
Right,
it went on to become an icon,
right,
for
right.
a lot of reasons.
Yeah, that movie, Children of Hiroshima, in Japanese it's called Genbaku no Ko, Children of the Bombing.
Mhm.
Some people criticize it in Japan for not being strong enough of a
I
protest
know, I
film.
heard about that.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, because
yeah.
I did research on the writer and director on that, actually,
Oh,
for another Japanese film,
uh-huh.
that has literary connections, The Whale God, which just came out
Oh,
about a
yeah,
year
yeah,
or
yeah.
so,
Right.
within the last year, and, Elijah Danny and I did an episode on it actually together, and, so it had connections.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'll have
yeah.
to I'll have to hear your podcast because
Oh, yeah,
that
I'll
that
send you
that
a list of episodes.
that novel, the novel that movie was based on, is another one of the things that I'd like to put into this kaiju
Oh,
anthology if I'm able to
yes,
get it
yes, yes,
published. Yeah.
we'll get to that because that's on my list of, potential books that we could, just chat about a little bit. But anyway, so, one other kind of big literary question, strap
Mhm.
in. So, is what would you say are the key differences and similarities between Japanese literature and we'll say American literature, just, for the sake of discussion right now,
Oh
since
boy, that's a
most of my viewers and listeners are American.
yeah, yeah. Um, Boy, where to start?
I know.
I'm not sure how to. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that because it's such a big question. Um, one of the one of the things. Well, so here, let me share this little anecdote. There was a really famous translator of Japanese literature by the name of Edward Seidensticker, and he, like, during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, he translated just like truckloads of Japanese literature for us, including many of the big classics, including some Mishima, the writer that you mentioned
Mhm.
before. He translated the Tale of Genji, the great classic
Mm, mhm, mhm,
from the 11th century. He is was brilliant, but he wrote this very interesting essay in which he said that Japanese literature, at least from the point of view of the West, is filled with strangely shaped stories. Those are his words. And his like, his point in this essay, which I found really fascinating when I read it, it's, maybe a little bit ethnocentric, it's written from a very American perspective, but, he points out that, like, Japanese literature, doesn't necessarily follow the same kind of contours that we might expect from English and British literature. That very often there's a lot of pieces of literature, and I think he wasn't thinking about kaiju literature here, but where there's a lot of pieces of literature which are uh, don't necessarily have the same kind of, like, strong big climax that I think that we're very often used to seeing in, towards the end of major pieces of English language literature.
mhm,
Oftentimes there's a lot of stories in Japan that are about people and their kind of lives, and you sort of jump in with them and spend some time with them, and then, then your time with them is over at the end of the
mhm,
story. So, it doesn't necessarily build up to this big crescendo of a
mhm.
climax. And when I read that essay, I was like, yeah, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Godzilla, of course, is a piece of
Yeah,
literature that does have a big climax,
yeah.
So, his sign sticker statements about Japanese literature don't apply across the board. But I do
Mhm,
think that there's some kind of truth to it that and sometimes we'll have, like, Japanese students in my Japanese literature classes read pieces of Japanese literature, and they're like, and, some pieces of literature can be very subtle. Like, we don't see,
mhm,
like, big, huge conflicts on every page, like I think we're used to seeing in American literature, British
mhm.
literature.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're can be kind of quiet.
Yeah, yeah, that's actually the impression that I've been getting with, just kind of taking in a lot of Japanese stories just in general, and knowing that that things like no theater and kabuki theater were very influential on Japanese film and kaiju cinema and tokusatsu and all of that.
Mhm.
And, so I recognize that there, and I know some of the story structures used in those theater arts found their way
Mhm.
in there. And in my estimation, and I don't know if this how much this necessarily applies to Japanese literature because I'm not as familiar with that, but
Mhm.
one of the as I've taken in a lot of essays and books and all that just talking about this, and one of the ones that stuck with me that actually made a lot of sense out of a lot of stuff Japanese media that I've seen, and that is one of the key differences, and this isn't true across the board, obviously, just like the like the 3 or 5 act structure, like if you're familiar with
Mm.
Shakespeare, the 5 act
Mhm.
structure where there's like very specific things that happen in each act of the play, and then act 4
Mhm.
is the big climax where the
Yeah.
the story comes to a head, and then you have this kind of resolution and descending
Mhm.
action in act 5. But
Mhm.
he said that a lot of Japanese stories operate under a structure where it's very much a slow burn
Mhm.
throughout
Mhm.
most of the story, and then it'll have a very fast and intense
Yeah.
finale, and then a very quick resolution after that.
Right, right. That's a traditional structure of no theater, this kind of
Mhm,
medieval theater that emerged and became very popular 13th, 14th century and continued up till modern day.
mhm,
And the structure that was created for no theater in Japanese is called jo hakyu. Jo means like introduction, ha means break, so that there's kind of a transition in what happens, and then kyu means sudden, like, so that there's some kind of sudden movement or some sort of sudden denouement, some sort of
mhm,
sudden kind of almost climactic ending.
mhm,
So you're right, like, so kind of slow burn up to a transition and then suddenly fast movement.
Hmm.
Yeah, that structure from No Theater does get carried over into quite a lot of modern writing. And I remember when I first learned about this when I was young, and I was really passionate about No Theater for a couple of years.
Hmm.
And when I learned about the structure, suddenly I began to see it in Japanese literature everywhere.
Yeah,
It just seemed
yeah,
like I saw it everywhere I looked. But
yeah, yeah,
I can't say
and
it's structures everything, but it
yes.
is a
Yeah.
different
Well,
kind of
yeah.
model.
Yeah. Same thing with, the 3 or the 5 act structure that is closely associated with Shakespeare. And Shakespeare probably for
Mhm.
English language literature, and Shakespeare probably didn't even come up with that himself. From what I understand, he was actually like copying a lot of what was just
Mm,
trendy at the time. It's
mm,
just that
okay.
his work just managed to survive and the test of time. Yeah,
Mm,
there were even I think there were even people who have said that, at least I think it's contemporaries of Shakespeare's time actually said like he wasn't the best playwright, but his
mm.
plays were the popular ones. Those are the ones that people went to go see. There were technically better playwrights,
Huh,
some of his contemporaries, but his is the
wow.
one are the ones that stood the test of time, like I said. But one of the things I don't think people realize is that the influence of theater on literature from a lot of different cultures is very
Yeah.
pervasive because for a long time and it sounds like it wasn't quite as true for Japan as it was for say in Europe, but because literature rates were not as high for a long time,
Mm.
theater was the the common man entertainment, and that
Oh, yeah.
you know pervaded into the actual written work, the sort of story structures and tropes and things like that. It was very influential.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's true of Japan as well. Despite the fact that literacy was relatively high, um, uh, in Japan, there absolute people loved theater, and for hundreds of years, well before the invention of cinema, that was where you went to have your big exciting literary experience. Yeah, you could read books, in the privacy of your own home. You could borrow in old Japan, there were people who went around with like carts, and you could borrow books for them for a fee, stuff like that.
Oh, mobile
But
libraries.
yeah, 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 yeah. But the theater was where people went for their like to be moved and to be overwhelmed by the visual scenarios in front of them. So, yeah, so theater is hugely important. I think in a way that for those of us who grew up and are living in the 21st century, theater often feels very far away from our lives in many regards. People, I think, in contemporary world, love are very passionate about musicals in particular. But like theater had such a gigantic impact on people's imagination. You know, and up until fairly recently. I don't
Yeah,
wanna say
yeah.
that it doesn't, because of course it
Yeah,
does for but
I was gonna say,
but
the theater has not gone away
right,
by
right,
any
right.
means, but it
Yeah,
isn't as prominent as it used to
yeah,
be. I think in large part because
right,
it's got a lot more competition for people's
right.
attentions anymore, Like,
Absolutely.
I mean, because
Cinema, yeah.
yeah, cinema is one of them. I mean, for the first season of the podcast, I did the King Kong films, and since, 2 of
Mm,
them, well, 3 of them really, take place in the 1930s. So I'm doing a lot of research on that particular era in American history.
mhm.
And one of the things that was interesting, and I had Danny on for this episode, it was actually his first appearance on the podcast, was we did Kong '05, and I did research on
Mm.
vaudeville and just finding out, what
Oh.
exactly was vaudeville and getting like a crash course in the history of vaudeville. And the funny thing is, and you actually see it in this movie because Ann Darrow is a struggling vaudeville actress, and that actually makes historical sense because the fact that she's even doing any vaudeville at all is a small miracle because that was
Mm.
basically right at the end of the run of vaudeville. Like it was basically over with by the late 20s because of
Interesting. Yeah,
competition with films and and other things. So,
yeah,
it was very much a dying, if not dead, art form
yeah.
at the time.
Mm. Mm. Wow.
So, anyway, that's one of my tangents.
No, no, great, great, I love it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I think that's a good kind of primer on all of this. So, we've been hinting at it a bit. Kayama gets contacted by Tomoyuki Tanaka. Hey, I want you to do this for me. So he basically, would you say he did the story? He didn't write the script. He did basically a story treatment.
So, so what he did was he gave Toho Studios uh, a it's usually called a scenario
Yeah.
in the documentation, but it's kind of half story and half script.
Mm.
So there are places in it where it's kind of like talking like this is what we should do on screen, and he's kind of talking about it from like a meta distance.
Ah.
But then there are other places where he kind of just gets into the story itself. And then there are other places where it's just very 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 straightforward. You know, uh, you know, Emiko says this. Ogata says that. And where it's just so what he gave them is kind of somewhere halfway between like a story treatment and a script,
Okay.
combining elements of both of them. And actually this book from which also contains the novellas that I translated does contain that first draft of the script that Kayama
Ooh.
gave to Toho Studios. Toho Studios, I think, is a little bit proprietary about some of their intellectual property. So I didn't get the permission to translate the text itself, just the novellas. But yeah, they're out there, and it's in this book.
Mhm. Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah, that's
another project for
actually
another day.
yeah, yeah, that's something that that interests that I find kind of interesting, and we'll go back to Kayama here in a second, but from what I remember from other interviews that bumped my microphone, sorry. But from what I've heard you say in some other interviews, you didn't really have to talk to Toho a whole lot about this project, which I find
I didn't.
really interesting. So,
Yeah.
do they own this book at all? It's just
No. Yeah. So this book, apparently the copyright is owned by some of the relatives of Kayama. So Kayama's
hmm,
estate. The copyright owner is a gentleman by the name of Yoshihiro Yamaguchi, and I don't know exactly what his relationship is to Kayama. Um, but yeah, so it was through the estate of Kayama, this
hmm.
Mr. Yamaguchi, that we were able to get the rights to do it. Um, but yeah, but the rights that he gave us were specifically the novellas and
Hmm.
not the script.
It
That
almost
would have involved a whole new process, I
I
think.
was gonna say, yeah, because that almost sounds a bit like how the King Kong rights have
Mm.
kind of been divvied up quite a bit. The whole
Oh.
it is weird trying to unravel that. I have attempted to do it. Like I've done an episode
Mm.
where I talk about it, but basically, like King Kong is partly in public domain and partly owned by about three different
Mm.
people.
Mm.
Primarily
Mm.
Universal, they're the primary rights
Mm.
holder, but the
Mm.
novelization
Mm.
going back, since we're talking
Mhm.
about novelization, the novelization
Mhm.
written by Lovelace, which was actually published several months before the movie came out. So it was that was the introduction the world got to King Kong was actually in novel form.
Hmm.
That fell into public domain in the early 60s.
Oh.
Well,
Mm.
but the film did not. The film,
Mm.
did not fall into public domain. But
Mhm.
since the novelization fell into public domain, that led to a bunch of copyright disputes and like
Mm.
the estate for the director, Miriam C. Cooper, they were claiming
Mhm.
rights to King Kong for a long time. And then after Miriam C. Cooper died, his estate was fighting over it. And then they got the
Mm.
rights in a legal dispute, but then sold them off. And
Mm.
but not
Wow.
all of them. It's wild to try to
Mm.
unravel that. So
Wow.
there's a little bit of kind of anybody can make a Kong story. Like I could, if I
Huh.
wanted to, I could write a
Huh.
King Kong story and not have to get permission from anybody to do it, so long as I only use a handful, as long as I just say, oh, it's the novelization, you know,
Mm. Mhm.
you know.
I see. I see.
So it's wild. That's why I was wondering. So
Yeah.
it
Yeah, it's interesting. Just to kind of build on that, you mentioned the method in which the world first saw, the story of King Kong. The way that the Japanese public first encountered the story of Godzilla was not in the film, but in the kind of lead up to the release of the film. There at there was a publicity wing at Toho Studios, and they put together a radio drama
Mhm.
of the Godzilla story, and it was broadcast in 12 different installments over the last half of 1954, kind of leading up to the release of the film. And of course, that's a brilliant technique because, of course, if you listen to that story, it probably felt very much like the famous Orson Welles War of the Worlds
Oh,
broadcast,
yeah.
like, in the States, very exciting to listen to. But listening to that story, of course, you're going to want to imagine, what does the monster look like? I have to
Mhm.
go see the movie.
Mhm.
And so it was a brilliant, brilliant method to whip up excitement about the story in the Japanese population, and it seems to
Mhm.
have worked.
Mhm.
Godzilla 1954 was a massive, like, box office success.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
it was between that and The Seven Samurai, Toho
yeah,
was swimming in money that year. Did Kayama have any?
1954 was a great year for Japanese
Oh, yeah.
film. Yeah,
Yeah.
3 there were 3 movies that broke all records for the biggest budget, um, in Japanese history from 1954. There are 3 of them. One of them was, The Seven Samurai, directed by Kurosawa. One of them was Godzilla, and,
Mhm.
that cost a lot of money because, of course, building all those little
Oh,
sets
yeah.
and, in, like, a
Yeah.
very compressed, amount of time cost money. And then the other one was the film Yamato Musashi, which has
Hmm.
been translated, I think, as the Samurai trilogy.
Oh,
The
yes,
first
yes,
movie
yes.
of
Yeah. Mhm.
that trilogy also was a 1954 production, and so,
Mhm. Mhm.
what a year for Japanese
Yeah,
cinema!
seriously, what
Three
a year.
classics.
Yeah, so was Kayama involved at all with that radio drama?
So Kayama's name appears on the radio drama, and as it appears as his work. However, my understanding is that actually the radio drama was done by somebody else within Toho Studios,
Okay.
that they're somebody in the publicity wing. So his name was on it, but I think in fact, the sources I've read say that it was ghost written by these other
Mhm.
people in Toho Studios publicity wing.
Okay.
That radio drama is also available. And it's one of the things I want to stick into that kaiju anthology if it gets picked up. Because I'd love the world to see the first form in which Godzilla was presented to the world,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
before the movie.
Yeah.
It interestingly enough, it differs from the movie in a number of very key points,
The
and
radio drama?
the radio drama,
Okay.
and that's because, like, the movie wasn't finalized when they were serializing it, when they were putting it on
Mhm.
the radio. It
Mhm.
was still in production, so there was
Yeah.
I think they were still kind of massaging the story and putting it together. So
Yeah, yeah, which we'll get into because I know that the Kayama novelization is pretty different at points too. In fact, really
mhm,
different in some key aspects, which
yeah.
we'll get to those. But it's interesting that now, are you talking about including the scripts for the radio drama?
Well, so yeah, I'd really like to do the script of the radio
Okay,
drama.
yeah,
That's
because I was
that's one of my dreams.
okay because I was just wondering because I understand, subtitling a movie or dubbing a movie. I understand translating text. I have
Mhm.
no idea how you would go about trying to quote unquote translate a piece that is purely audio.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's an interesting thing. You know, I don't know. I think it works pretty well on the page when you read it.
Mhm.
It's a lot like reading the script of a play. Um,
Yeah.
so there's not a lot of description about when we all think of Godzilla, we all imagine the scenes of destruction as Godzilla is rampaging through Tokyo or other major cities, in subsequent movies.
Mhm.
Those are the things we think of first. But those are kind of handled through sound effects and things like
Yes.
that in the radio drama. So
Yeah.
so the story focuses less on those kind of scenes of destruction and so on than the kind of dialogue in interactions between the characters.
Right. I wonder, a thought that went through my head is if you can get the scripts translated and published. I wonder if maybe what could be done is doing a new English language reading and recording. of
That
that.
would be
That
great.
would be really exciting.
That would be so fun. Absolutely, absolutely. I got word not so long ago that that the novelizations are going to be
Mhm.
there's going to be an audiobook of them. So I'm super
Ooh.
excited about that. So there's so many sound effects in this that I kind of wonder what it's going to sound
Yeah,
like.
that is something
Um,
that I do, once we, let's go back to, to talking about that a little bit
yeah,
because,
but
because like we can talk about the differences, we can talk about let's talk about the actual style of the book and then we'll talk about
okay,
some of those key
sure.
differences there. Because that eh, I was a little surprised reading this, seeing, how it was written and the funny thing is when I was a wee lad cutting my teeth trying to learn the craft of writing before going into to college and getting formal
Mhm.
training on all of this sort of stuff. I do remember growing up doing things a little bit similar to what Kayama was doing, funny enough.
Yeah.
And probably I would say the most distinctive style, a feature of his style, I should say, in this book, as you were alluding to, is his use of onomatopoeia.
Yeah.
Which I was not expecting, when I first read these. Now, I think it's much more prominent in the 54 novelization and not so much in Raids Again, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
It yeah, you're totally right. Like in the for I'm not sure if everyone knows the word onomatopoeia, but
Mhm.
onomatopoeia like refers to a sound related word. So words like bang, crash, pow, bang.
Yes.
Did I say
If
bang
you've
twice?
read comic books or watched Batman
Yeah,
66, you know
yeah,
all about it.
yeah. Right, right. Yeah, totally. Exactly. So when I first read the novelizations, there are so many sound related words that I immediately thought of the Batman, series, the manga and the Adam West, things that
Mhm.
I watched when I was a kid. There's so many sound related words, and Kayama likes to use sound related words even when he doesn't have to. Like he'll say something like, and then she hit the light switch, click. Like
Yes.
you don't need to write in the word click usually, but Kayama likes that, and he put in lots and lots and lots of sound words. And when I first was thinking about translating it, I thought, well, it might seem a little bit ridiculous to English readers to see so many sound related words, like so many kapows and bangs and booms, especially when, Godzilla's trampling through Tokyo. Like it seems like every other word is a onomatopoeia. But that's part of Kayama's style, and that's what makes this story so unique. I read a funny review online where someone, some reader had written a review it, and he said the scenes in which Godzilla is in Tokyo. Let me sum it up. Bang, and he wrote a bunch of sound effects there.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
thought, well,
I'm actually
that's not wrong.
yeah, because I'm kind of flipping through just to, remind myself of that. I think
Uh-huh.
I came across to one of those ones about the light switch
Yeah.
because it says click. Hagiwara pressed the shutter button on his camera.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. There's so many things like that, and yeah, yeah, yeah. Like here's one line from page 73. Grrr! The enraged monster grabbed the train, which was now lying on its side, and crunch bit down on it. And then
Yes.
crunch, crash. He shook it back and forth with the force of his enormous body. Blah, 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 blah. So, lots of sound words. But that's kind of it's fun. And that's part of Kayama's distinctive style. So I decided to try to keep as much sound in there as
Mhm.
possible and so
Yep.
that this would be a roaring, crashing, banging translation.
Yeah, yeah. I like what you did there. Also, this is just kind of hilarious. This is one of the rare instances where you have a fiction book with a footnote.
Oh,
I
yeah.
I remember when I saw that, it cracked me up a little. I was like, "What? A
Oh,
footnote?"
yeah, there were a couple of things in here where it's just like where the like the editor kind of prompted me. He's like, "I don't get what's going on here. Can you explain this a little bit?" It's like I couldn't figure out where to put that information in except
Yeah.
other than a footnote.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it cracked me up because I'm trying to remember what was it. I think it was Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton. I think he
Okay.
actually wrote a footnote in there, but it was a fake footnote. It was just
Oh,
part of it was just
nice.
actually part of it was intended to just be part of the novel or something like that. I haven't
Mm.
read it, so I don't remember offhand. I just remember somebody who had read it telling me that, and I was like, "Well, that sounds a little Inception-y."
Nice.
Yeah, I'm still not entirely sure what to what to make of that. So you have all you have all this onomatopoeia, and
Mm.
for what I can remember, it's been a little while since I read it. It's pretty breezy. It does read pretty quick.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kayama's style is, some might consider it to be pretty straightforward in terms of
Hmm.
in terms of how it's written. Is
Hmm.
that just what he does in these books? I remember you mentioned in some other interviews that he intentionally kept some things kind of vague because he knew that these were, you know, these are either were going to be made into film, so
Yeah.
he's not going to necessarily go into a lot of detail, or
Yeah.
is that just how he did things? Because this is the only work of Kayama's I've read at the moment.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, right, right. This is, I think, the only thing that's exists in English.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, like, when he wrote the first draft of the scenario for Toho Studios, he didn't include a lot of detail about the destruction scenes, because I think, like as you just alluded to, the assumption his assumption was, well, the special effects guys, Eiji Tsuburaya, he's gonna do whatever the heck he wants, and I can't really quite predict that. So we'll just leave the details of those scenes up to him. So the scenario that he wrote and turned into Toho is a little bit sketchier when it comes to some of those places. Um, but then when he turned around into these novelizations that I've translated, he then kind of, builds upon Tsuburaya's imagination and kind of turns that back into text for us.
Hmm.
He is. I think that your way of describing his style is quite apt. He was pretty breezy. He's very concrete about a lot of description, but they're often, he loves cryptids, he loves odd creatures, he loves kind of bizarre little things that the world has never seen, and so a lot of those kind of creatures appear in his stories, and sometimes I feel like he's good at giving us enough description to incite our imagination, but not too much that
Hmm.
that it overwhelms us. That he gives us just enough food for the imagination to kind of let our imagination go wild,
Hmm.
and there's a kind of particular skill, I think, that's involved in giving us just not too much detail, not too little
Hmm.
detail, but just the right amount. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think he's good at that.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest with you. I think you talk to any writer, and they're going to tell you that that's one of their great struggles is figuring out how to do that.
Yeah.
That's still
Oh
one of
yeah.
my struggles, trying to figure out exactly how much to give and how to give it, and things
Hmm.
like that. I you know well, actually, for a long time, one of my great struggles was basically just finding my authorial voice, and figuring out
Oh
what
yeah.
that would be. And
Oh yeah.
and some people like Kayama, they're very good at the at doing the straightforward stuff, which seems to be
Huh?
relatively common with a lot of particularly science fiction authors. Is they
Yeah.
they seem to gravitate toward that sort of a style. But then
Hmm.
you look even just in the literary scene, you had contemporaries like Ernest Hemingway or
Mm.
William Faulkner, who very different approaches to the same sort of
Mhm.
material. But Hemingway was a
Yeah.
journalist when
Mhm.
before he was a novelist, so that really comes through. He likes punchy sentences and smaller words, but they're small, very concrete words. And Faulkner abused the semicolon.
Abused. Brought to
Yeah.
life. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
but it's interesting. So yeah, I'm just trying. I'm just trying to figure out, because
Yeah.
obviously this is a translation, and
Mhm. Yeah.
so part of me does kind of wonders, like, how does this, how does this compare to how it reads
Yeah.
in
Oh, of
Japanese?
course. Right. Yeah. And that's a really good question. So because the text tends to describe so many kind of visual scenes,
Hmm.
a lot of I think the visual scenes those are relatively easy to kind of bring over, into a new language because, you know, the book describes it, sort of as a visual scene, and and then I can, if I follow along and stay really, really close to the text, for the most part, I'm able to kind of create the same visual image for an English reader.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have to do a this book really didn't require me to do a lot of adaptation, or I didn't do any localization. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, overtly,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, like, I mean, there are always some small things that change in translation, of course. Sometimes a sentence that gets really long and unwieldy in English, I might use a semicolon
Yes.
or break it into two or something like that to
Mm-hmm.
kind of help it read a little bit more smoothly. But
Mm-hmm.
I felt like, at least in this text, I was able to really stay fairly close to the text as it was in the original.
Yeah.
I didn't have to introduce too much more cultural information. And when I did introduce some cultural information that I thought might be helpful, I knew I was going to do the afterwards. So I thought, oh, that's a great place. I can stick all
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
cultural
Which
information.
Yeah,
Yeah,
which,
back there.
there are, you said you didn't have to do too much localization or changes, or, but I know that there's one in particular that, was a bit of a sticking point with your students, which we'll
Okay.
get to that. But I
Oh
do
yeah, yeah,
have
yeah,
a,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, but I do have a question that, and this is, I could, me kind of speaking
Uh-huh.
in ignorance here, because I've never sat down and really studied, like, I will say a book written in Japanese to
Uh-huh.
see what it looks like. But so pardon me for asking what might seem like
It's okay.
a very basic question, but but this is me as someone who is a writer and has done interior design for books, and has done
Hmm.
professional editing for people and all of that, and in particular because I'm thinking, if I just did a book editing project for somebody where this person didn't seem to not understand how paragraphing works. So
Oh,
so I'm just sitting here and I'm wondering, is like, does Japan written Japanese have what we as English speakers would term a paragraph, or was that part of the
yeah.
adapting process that you had to do?
No, so Japanese does have paragraphs,
Mm,
but there are some small differences between the way that paragraphing works in Japanese and it works in English. For instance, we might embed a quotation in a paragraph. In Japan, and especially in Kayama's time, it was very common. Every time somebody starts a quotation, even if it's in mid sentence, they will move it up to a new paragraph. So
mm.
do you know what I mean? So like,
Yes.
so blah blah blah. There, he walked down the road, and while looking over his shoulder, he said, and then the quote begins.
Mhm.
Um, right where the quote begins in Japanese, that would be moved up to the top of a new line.
Mm.
Top of a new line. I say top of a new line because Japanese is written vertically, right?
Yes.
Um, but yeah, so I mean, he was following the paragraphing traditions of his time. That's one small, localization, I guess, that I made.
Yep.
When I followed the kind of common methods of paragraphing in
Yep.
English, but I don't think that really affected the flow of
No.
the work.
No, but it
Um,
was something I was wondering, because
yeah,
most of the paragraphs in this book are very short. Like, it's pretty
yeah,
punchy.
it is, yeah, and that's true. Like that's really part of Kayama's style. He really is pretty terse. I mean, he's not verbose ever at
Mm,
all, I think.
mhm,
He really gives you the image, he gives you the information you need, and then moves on.
mhm.
Um, yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
How is dialogue handled in Japanese prose?
Well, I'm pretty much like in English. I
Okay.
mean, you get the back and forth.
Mhm.
Yeah, and quotations. Not every author uses quotations. Japanese traditionally did not use quotations and before the 19th century, and so not every author follows modern. Some
Yeah.
authors follow kind of more
Yeah, because
pre-modern models,
this is
but
very dialogue driven at
yeah,
points as
it
well.
is.
That's another reason why I
Right.
was wondering.
Yeah, yeah, and I think again that's partly because Kayama had the script, right? He
Mhm.
was part of the script, and so that he was, I think, following along the script and adapting it in some
Mm,
ways as he
yeah.
worked. So
Okay.
you're right. So dialogue is a big part of it.
Yeah. Okay. Another very basic question that I'm asking
Mhm,
out of sheer curiosity: does Japanese
mhm.
have anything that would be an equivalent to a to a? I almost did it myself. Yeah, a quotation mark.
Yes, it does. It does.
Mm.
Ooh, let's see. Can I show you? Yeah. Yeah. Here, I'm just opening a book to a page. If you look at the top of these, you'll see these like at the top
Hmm.
of the page.
Yes.
That at the top of the second line, there's like a little bent line.
Hmm.
That's the beginning. That's like the open quotation mark. And if you move down somewhere,
Oh,
maybe you can see. I don't know somewhere.
yes,
I
I
don't know
can
where.
see it.
Yeah, somewhere. Yeah, there's another one that kind of goes in the opposite direction, which is the end of the quotation.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so that's, it doesn't look like, it doesn't look like 2 dots, but it has a different shape, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I
it
was just
serves in
wondering.
exactly the same function.
Right. It was just something I have wondered because I know different languages handle
Mhm.
direct quotations differently, and that
Right,
can
true.
make translation work a little
Yeah,
difficult sometimes depending
yeah,
on the language and that
yeah,
the source language and then the language that you're trying to translate it
yeah,
into. Because I know like a lot of what we would call dead languages, they
mhm.
didn't have anything that would demark
Right,
actual quotations. So the
right,
translators have to kind of make a call about
right.
how they want to handle that, which then requires a certain level of interpretation.
Yes,
How do you
yes.
make this work? And sometimes
Uh-huh.
that can get a little bit
It can get
dicey.
sticky. It
Yeah.
can, yeah. Yeah, and that was very much an issue, like, if you're translating pre-modern Japanese literature, that's
Mhm.
very much an issue, 'cause that little quotation mark, like, thing that I just showed you, called a kagikakko in Japanese, that was invented in the 19th century,
Mm.
it didn't it was basically inspired by Western models.
I was gonna say,
So,
yeah. Yeah, I was figuring that
yeah.
that must have been a Western influence there.
Yeah. Yeah, and so, if you read, like, pre-modern Japanese literature written, before kind of all this Western influence came in, actually, it can be very beautiful at times because like, sometimes even within the same sentence, you're floating in and out of the character's mind,
Mhm.
and, like, sort of the boundaries between the inner world of the characters and the external world of the characters are blurred, and actually that produces some, I think, some really interesting literary effects. Anyway, but that's not Kayama. So,
No, no, no,
but
no, no.
yeah, those
No,
things are
no, but
possible
this
in
is
Japanese.
but these are just the kind like I said, I feel like I'm a
Yeah,
student again, and in
no,
class,
no,
and I'm like, "I want to pick your brain. I have to know these things."
Nathan, I'm glad you're asking these questions because no one's asked me these questions before. So
Oh, yeah,
I'm
that's
thrilled.
yeah, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, funny, yeah, here's a funny example of the onomatopoeia. It's a couple
Uh,
times in the same paragraph, it's just whoosh, whoosh, whoosh.
yeah,
Yeah. Actually, which
I,
actually, that kinda reminds me because there are sometimes, like, either it's the onomatopoeia or some of the dialogue where you do what yeah, I would tell you that a lot of writing teachers and whatnot would actually tell you, not to bother doing things like, you know, lots of, the connecting vowels to indicate the sound, or like there was one page I looked at where somebody had an elongated, because they always tell you, writing teachers always tell you, take all of those out,
right,
as
right,
much
right,
as possible, unless you can
right,
justify it. But,
right.
when you're going through and like some of the like the scream lines right here is like, ah, how are you how are you making the decision to decide how long do these have to be?
So Kayama likes to extend vowels and things like that when he does exactly that same thing in Japanese. Like, Godzilla, when he roars in Japanese, in the book, in the film he's got his very distinctive roar, but in the book the way he roars is with the onomatopoeia "gwa," and
Yeah.
um, and then base like some at points, uh, that and other onomatopoeias, sometimes, Kayama will write a line beneath it to kind of extend the sound of it. So
Okay.
it's not just "gua," but like "gua," that kinda goes
Mhm.
on. And I kinda looked at how long the line was. I thought, "Oh, how many times should I, write, how many vowels should I put in this on
Yeah.
a particular
It's like,
instance?"
yeah.
So I was taking cues from the original text itself,
Okay. I was just wondering if
but
that
I
was a choice that you had to make or if that's actually from the
it
text. This sounds like the
no,
silliest
no, no.
minutia that people would ask, but like I said,
No.
this stuff fascinates
I love
me,
it.
because I do this.
But, I spent a bunch of time on these things thinking about, like, what to do with onomatopoeias. One other thing about onomatopoeias is that Japanese, has so many onomatopoeias, many more than in English. I think probably in order maybe 10 times, 15 times, I don't know how
Oh,
many times, but way far, far, far more than we have in English. They're
yeah.
very, very specific words to describe very specific sounds. And so sometimes I had trouble even figuring out like, well, what would an equivalent be? One of these onomatopoetic expressions that Kayama loves and uses over and over again is the onomatopoeia meri meri. And the meri meri, uh, I mean, if you listen to it in English, you probably can't even guess what it is. But what meri meri represents in Japanese is kind of the sound of like something crumpling up. Like,
Mm.
you imagine like putting your foot on a tin can and the tin can kind of goes, that sound is meri meri in Japanese.
Ah.
And so is how do you like it's a very specific kind of crunching sound,
Mhm.
like of something collapsing. And just not like, there's not a super obvious word that jumped to mind, when
Mhm.
translating that. So
Mhm.
I sometimes had to figure out like, okay, how am I going to differentiate this crash or that boom from,
Yeah. Yeah.
this other one,
Yeah.
so
That's that just to show what the kind of nerd that I am, when you said "midi midi," I had to I had to tell myself, "Wait, no, that was an M," because I was thinking of
yeah.
the official onomatopoeia for Ghidorah, which is "beady beady."
Ah,
For
yeah,
classic Ghidorah,
okay.
it's a "beady beady, beady beady."
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
For, that, yeah.
It's so fun how, like, yeah, all the kaiju movies, each of the kaiju has their own distinctive roar, which is kind of
Yeah.
like its calling card, I think I heard
Yeah, yeah,
someone
which
say
was
once.
one of the things
Uh,
that I thought was interesting in here as a Godzilla fan, because obviously you're using the actual word that Kayama is using, which is not the actual official onomatopoeia for
right,
Godzilla's roar. It's
right.
which you see now, like if you read even the American comic books, they will put this in there, and it's screonk, which is
Yeah.
totally made up word, but somebody worked really hard to figure out how to transcribe that. But so it's Skreong, Skreonk.
Yeah, I don't get it.
Yeah. So, and I was looking, I was like, oh, it's not Skreonk in this.
No, no, no. Well, it was so that actually kind of brings up an interesting question because it's like when I translated this, I decided to kind of yeah, you're right. There's all this other kind of other Godzilla stuff. There Godzilla manga, there are Godzilla, comics produced in the West. There's all sorts of Godzilla related stuff. And I wondered to a certain extent, like how much should I kind of borrow the language that's already been established by those texts. And for the I kind of didn't want to do, like, a lot of borrowing because I really wanted to try to show, like, Kayama's very
Mm.
distinctive vision of Godzilla. So I tried not to refer to all the existing texts. I even ignored, like, the Criterion Collection's subtitles because I didn't wanna be too overly
Oh yeah,
influenced by them.
for sure.
Um, but but there were a couple places where I felt like I had to cave to tradition, and one of them was, in the original Japanese of this, here,
Yeah.
Kayama, when he's referring to the islands that Godzilla where he makes his first appearance, it's in we all refer to it in English as Odo Islands, but in I was very surprised to read this and to see that it was not Odo, but Oto. And so it's not a D, but a T sound. And I was like, what? This has to be a mistake. What? This has to be a mistake. And then I looked at other editions of the same book, and it's always to, and it's always a T rather than a D. But I figured like if I wrote OTO Islands rather than ODO Island, then I would get like stacks of angry letters from Godzilla fans saying like, "How could you make a huge mistake, like this? It's such a critical detail." And so I
And then
came
you reply by
to
saying, it's like, did you
tradition.
read the afterward?
I did. I mentioned that fact very specifically afterward because it bothered me. I didn't want to change it to,
Mhm,
o- to I mean, I didn't want to change it to Odo to kind of just match the
mhm.
everything else that's out there. Because in a way, this is sort of like kind of Godzilla's origin story here.
Yes.
If anything, they should be imitating this. But
Mhm.
yeah, so And
That
actually in Japanese, the sounds do and to are very closely related, and
I
depending on
was
the
gonna
dialect,
say I was gonna say,
Japanese,
is that
there might be blurring.
I was gonna say, I was wondering, was that a change that I was gonna ask if that was a change that just happened when they went to, when the script was written or something like, 'cause and I did look up the screenwriter who did the
Mhm.
work on there. His name was Takeo Murata, and also
Right.
director Shiro Honda is credited as well.
Yeah.
Because that was, from what
Right.
I understand, that was very common back then where the
Mhm.
directors they would make a lot of alterations to the
Right.
script as well, so they usually ended up
Right.
getting co-screenwriter credit. But
Right.
Takeo Murata is the, primary one, and he
Right.
also, if I remember correctly, he also worked on Raids Again.
So yeah, and so one of the ways that that dialogue was handled, like 50s and 60s in Japan, was on set. They would very often have a chalkboard where they would have the dialogue for the scene written out, and in the course of, like, working on it and filming it, if they began to feel like, "Oh, that doesn't work quite as well on film as we thought it would. Well, here, let's erase it and change it." And so they would
Mhm.
actually kind of, like, work out the details of the text, sometimes right there on the set, on the chalkboard. So there was a certain sense in which, like, at least some of the small details of the dialogue were kind of adjusted and fine-tuned
Mhm.
right there at the moment. And because the director was right there and kind of helping to make those changes, that's the reason that the directors are often credited as a
Yeah.
co-screenwriter,
Yeah.
in,
Yeah,
in Japanese film at this time.
I do think somewhere I have seen it translated as Oto. I just can't remember where. But I feel like I've
Yeah,
seen it one other place like that.
yeah. That's good to hear because that is how it is in Kayama's novelizations.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, no, that was a big surprise to me to see.
yeah, well, and actually, since we're on the subject of that,
Mhm.
you brought up something that I thought was really interesting
Okay.
related to that particular name.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. It was because I had watched the movie and I'd heard the name Odo Islands. And we never see it written. Well, no, actually, there is one small place in the movie where we see it written down, and that's when the characters are getting off the bus and they're going
Mhm.
to speak at the national diet. There's to go speak to the politicians. They hold up a sign that says like I can't remember the exact wording, but it says like the party from Odo Islands, like the
Mhm. Yes.
a disaster party or something.
Mhm.
And so it is written there. There's one place in the film where we do see the characters for writing it. But the characters that are used to write Odo Islands are oh shoot, I should have brought a marker so I could write it and hold it up to the screen. But it's written with the character for big
Mhm.
and then the character for door. So in other words, Odo Island is the big door through which the big guy himself kind of
Mhm.
enters the
Yeah.
world. And so
Yeah.
that kind of like that hint about Godzilla and his origin is sort of embedded there in the name of the island itself, which
That
I thought was
is
pretty interesting.
that is so fascinating.
Oh,
Anyway,
thanks.
I honestly did not know that, because I will
Yeah.
admit, that when I discovered Godzilla, I was a little older than a lot of the people I talk to because they're usually in,
Uh,
grade school or whatever. I was a little bit older. I was probably in middle school when I first
uh,
started getting into this.
uh-huh.
And before that, there was a popular character on Star Trek Deep Space Nine whose name was Odo. He was a shapeshifter.
Oh, I've forgotten
And
about
so
that.
yeah, so the first time I watched
Hmm.
Godzilla and they're talking about Odo Island, I'm like, "Wait, what?" And then I was
Oh.
sitting here thinking, it's like, "Wait a minute. Is there greater significance to this character's name than I knew?"
Yeah, no, that makes you wonder if there was a Godzilla fan somewhere on the staff there.
I don't know, but like I said, he was a shapeshifter, he was the constable, so basically he was the police chief on
Mm,
the station, so I don't know. I
mm,
really don't know, but, that was where my brain went for a while
yeah,
after I first got into this.
interesting.
And it's probably an example of, the creators on the show might have just made up a name and not realizing that
Mhm.
it's actually from another language. You'd be surprised how often
Yeah.
that can happen,
Oh,
you
right,
know?
right, right.
Yeah, it's the
Yeah.
funny thing about languages is that, they, sometimes they can become unintentional puns, when you go from
Mhm.
one language to another. If an English speaker hears something from a foreign language, they're like, wait a minute.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It throws them off, or, that's why humor, doesn't always translate, when you're going from one language to another, because something could be a pun
Mhm.
in Japanese, but it makes no sense in English or another language.
Yeah, in Godzilla Raids Again, there was a kind of running joke in the text that suddenly one of the characters in there, Kobayashi,
Mhm.
he starts talking about going out and hunting for fish, like he's talking about going out and searching for a bride, and that's kind of funny in the original Japanese, but when I translated it kind of pretty literally, without any explanation, in the text, and I showed it to my partner and to some students and stuff like that, they're kind of like, "What's going on here? What's this running thing about brides? I don't get it." So, I realized that it didn't come across as funny like it did in Japanese, and so I, um, I think I adjusted it by my kind of, like, adding a sentence or 2 to kind of explain it a little bit, you know?
Mhm.
So that was one very small place in which I did a kind of small, not exactly localization, but I tried to bridge the understanding between a Japanese readership and English
Right.
audience. My point is that humor is hard to translate, and it
Yeah.
often doesn't come across as, hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah, because a lot of times I know with translation work, you have to make a decision of, do you translate or transliterate? You know?
There's
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
yeah,
you have to,
or
do you go for exactly what the text says, or do you favor communicating the idea?
yeah,
Yeah.
like paraphrase, yeah,
Yeah, a
yeah,
bit of a
yeah,
paraphrase,
that's right,
and it's not
yeah,
just with, with actual, text like this,
mhm.
but it could also be if you're dubbing or subtitling a movie.
Oh, yeah.
Because I've gone on record as saying that I know that the Criterion Godzilla set got some grief, and I do think some
Mm,
legitimate criticism from fans for some of its
uh-huh,
presentation and
yeah,
all that. But one thing that I wish more people would talk about is that, like, I thought their subtitling work, particularly on several of those movies that before either had, less than impressive subtitles or dub titles or whatever. Now we have actual subtitles or they just subtitle more stuff, like they subtitle the songs that are in each of
oh, yeah,
that are in the movies, when before they may have
mhm.
not been subtitled or something like
Yeah,
that. And I have been
yeah,
told that some of the subtitles that Criterion used they were kind of paraphrasing a little bit, communicating the idea, but not necessarily telling you exactly what they're saying. And I've picked up on that a little bit, like I'll hear certain words, or they'll mention a character's name, but it'll just be a pronoun, in
yeah,
there or
yeah,
something like that.
yeah,
I was like, oh,
right,
okay. I get
right,
what's actually going on here, but
yeah,
or they take
th
a little bit of a creative liberty, like there are not this. I guess they would technically be honorifics, but like familial
mm.
terms,
Oh, yes,
like
yes,
Nissan or something like that.
yeah,
And they'll
right,
actually, as I'm watching a piece of media, they'll actually say that, and that's
yeah.
I try to remember, that's brother, right? Or is it sister?
Yeah, Oni-san, that's right, Oni-san is older brother,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So
One is
yeah,
older
so
sister, yeah,
so you'll have siblings and they say terms like that to each
mhm,
other, but the subtitle will
yeah,
just be the character's name. And I'm like, okay,
right,
that's a
right, right,
transliteration. That's what they're going with. Like, that is what they're doing in Japanese is equivalent to, me just, talking to my brother Jared,
yeah,
so
yeah, yeah,
or somebody, just calling him by his name, because that's
yeah,
one of the things, that's one of the key differences between Japanese and English, is all of these honorifics.
right,
There's
right,
some equivalents in English, but not nearly as many. So that's one of
right.
the things that I know translators have to play around a little bit to kind of, they have to transliterate that, because there's
Yeah.
no real equivalent in English for it.
You raise a really, really good and interesting point here. You're totally right. Like, if we were to sit down and translate Japanese super literally, like, trying to adhere for like almost one-to-one kind of word translation, it would very quickly like end up nonsense. It would be very hard to understand, and partly because it's just the way that Japanese people phrase things is different. Like,
Mhm.
we were more likely to say, he or she in English, whereas in Japanese, you're very likely to say the person's name, like,
Mhm.
oh, Kyoko said this, or,
Mhm.
Takashi said that, and rather than he or she or he or whatever.
Mhm.
It's very common to use people's names, even if you're talking right to them. Like, you might, instead of in English, we might say, "Are you going to the store tomorrow?" And I might, in Japanese, I might say, "Nate-san's is going to the store tomorrow."
Mhm.
And so it's, you'll keep the name in there. Um, Actually, pronouns are a lot less used in Japanese than in English, whereas we have
Mhm.
to kind of mark almost every subject as either masculine or feminine. It's kind of unfortunate, but yeah. So Japanese is, there's a lot of ways in which the Japanese language is different, and honorifics is absolutely one of them. Honorific language, for people who aren't familiar with that concept, is like, honorific would be like, say, if I'm talking about myself going to a place, I might use one verb that means go. But if I'm talking about someone like, maybe, the president of my company or whatever, I might use very respectful language that also means go, but it's a completely different word that embeds like a level of respect in it. And Japanese is a very different language than English, in that every single utterance, every single thing that you say is coded by the social relationship between the speaker and the listener.
Mhm.
And so, like, I would use a different, like, in my example, like, I might use a different go to talk about myself going, might use a different go to talk about you going, a different go to talk about someone
Mhm.
very high ranking on the totem pole going, and
Mhm.
and so those can kind of switch depending on who I'm talking to, and so on. But like, all this kind of like relationship, we only have one word that means go in English, basically.
Mhm.
There's not, like, whereas in Japanese there might be, 10 or 12, in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
course of a book.
yeah.
And those kind of like cultural elements are very hard to capture. For instance, one thing that like I didn't capture very well in English, and I'll freely admit this, is that in 1950s Japan, it was very common for women to speak to men in extremely polite language that seems unreasonably polite by today's
Mhm.
standards. And so, like, for instance, the character Emiko in the book, and even in the movie, speaks very, very polite, very refined Japanese. And even when she's speaking to her father, even when she's speaking to someone in her own family. And so, it's hard to sometimes capture those kind of nuances of word choice,
Mhm.
when in English we only have like one way to say go. So
Yeah, yeah, well, and what you're talking about there actually makes sense. This was the mid 50s, less than a decade after World War II, and I've talked about this actually. That was at a time when Japan was very much, culturally speaking, was very much in a transition. It was
yeah,
a
yeah,
very patriarchal culture right
yes,
up to World War II, and the occupation started chipping away at that a little bit when the Americans are introducing democracy, and they convert Japan
hmm,
to a democracy over the course of those 7 years. The emperor is allowed to stay on the throne, but he's a figurehead. The real leader of Japan is a prime minister, and then there was a lot of these Western ideas that are really getting inundated into the culture at the time, and
hmm,
women's rights, I know, was a big part of that, in that decade, and then for
yeah,
several years after that. And that's why the love triangle in the film is interesting, because
hmm,
the relationship that Emiko has with Sarazawa is very indicative of the old way of doing things, the old Japanese culture, where it's the
true,
parents who are arranging the marriages for their children, and they have basically most, if not all, of the say in that. Whereas Emiko has, like, I want Ogata.
yeah,
Ogata and we have chosen each other. That's more of a Western
yeah,
idea. This Western concept of
yeah,
dating and choosing who you get
yeah,
to marry. And she's actually in love with Ogata, whereas it's very formal for
right,
her and Sarazawa. She even says that she thinks of him more as a brother than anything else.
hmm,
And so,
right,
I'm not surprised at all that Emiko is speaking this very elevated, polite
yeah,
Japanese, because that's still kind of like, it's still in that kind of moment where there is still some of that traditional culture that's still there, but she's still kind of wanting to get out of it a little bit. That's one of the main emotional conflicts of the story.
I think, yeah, you put your finger on something that's really, really interesting there. You're totally right. That in up until maybe 1940, 30s, 40s, 50s, we're kind of an era of transition about concepts of love.
Mhm.
And, up until, maybe around the 1950s, like lots and lots of, and even sometimes afterward, a lot of marriages were made more about the prestige of the family, carrying on the family lineage, making sure that your wealth, goes to somebody, you know, of your comparable class or whatever. Um, like marriage was so much more about kind of these forming connections rather than it was
Mhm.
about, choosing, the partner that's going to be your existential match.
Mhm.
Um, so there really was a big change, and it didn't happen overnight that Japan switched
No.
from kind of an arranged system um, to a love system, but
Mhm.
and I also don't, those things aren't necessarily 100% dichotomous because it's like,
No.
ideally, like, the ideal situation in the arranged marriage situation is that the parent would pick out and help find someone who would be comparable, and
Mhm.
because they were comparable and matched up in a bunch of ways, hopefully they would fall in love. That was the
Yeah.
ideal, but it didn't always work out like that, of
Yeah.
course.
Well,
Yeah.
but it's
Anyway.
interesting that you bring up that it was like the 30s, 40s, and 50s when this was going on, because I don't know how familiar you are with the biography of Ishiro Honda, the director of this film,
Mhm.
but I actually, I've got it sitting up here on my shelf. So if you ever want an interesting book to read,
Oh,
especially,
yes, yes.
you know,
Uh-huh.
so check that one out. And there's a bit in there that talks about Honda, meeting his wife and all that. And this, was in like the mid to late 30s. And it was very countercultural because they both just found each other, liked each other, and decided to get married. So they were still kind of
Yeah.
bucking against it a little bit. It's interesting reading that and then remembering what happened in this
Yeah.
film.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. The
so,
30s was a time when things were really changing, and,
oh,
yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we've got into a lot of interesting stuff about the style of this book. I do want to talk, let's get into, well, I'm trying to think, there's like two places we could go with this. You hinted at it. Since you hinted at it, we'll talk about that. But you're talking
Okay.
about the because I know this was a sticking point that you talk about in the afterwards, like the one big sticking point, and that
The
was the
pronouns?
usage of pronouns for Godzilla. How that turned into this big to do.
Oh my god. Yeah. I think half of the time, half of the time that I spent revising this book was over this question of pronouns. Um, in the original Japanese, there is not even the slightest hint anywhere. I went back through and I reread it, like I don't even know how many times, and working on it, but there's not the slightest hint anywhere about Godzilla's gender. None. Zero. So it's not clear if Godzilla is a he, if Godzilla is a she. You know, um, my understanding is that I don't know much about about reptiles or amphibians or dinosaurs, but my understanding is that there are certain creatures out there in the world that are hermaphroditic
Mhm,
and may and don't necessarily conform to kind of this very binary forms of gender that we think of. And so, that raises the very interesting question, like, how am I going to refer to Godzilla? In Japanese, it's very easy to avoid pronouns. You never have to use a pronoun if it's clear who you're talking about. So
mhm,
you're talking about Godzilla in one sentence. The next sentence, if you're still talking about Godzilla, you just don't even put in a subject because we know it's Godzilla. Japanese doesn't require you to put a subject in every single sentence. So, but in English, we do require some subject in every sentence. And you can't say Godzilla did this, Godzilla did that, Godzilla did this, Godzilla did that 1,000 times in succession, right? You have to use a pronoun, and then you get to these things like Godzilla raised hand,
mhm,
like Godzilla raised his hand, Godzilla raised her hand, Godzilla raised
mhm,
its hand. What do
mhm,
you say? Because there's no indication of gender, my first inclination was to call Godzilla it everywhere
mhm,
and just to try to avoid the gender problem altogether. but when I showed it to my students, the students were actually super excited to read this. My first students were the first people ever to read this on the planet, and they were all excited about it. And we we talked about it endlessly in class. And there were a lot of students who said, "Oh, I love the book, but Godzilla has too much personality to be just an it." The word "it" seems so reductive and far away, and I get it. I have to admit that I feel the same way. So I'm like, well, so then my second attempt, I went back through and I started changing it, and then I showed it to my students again. I decided to try, how in our current worlds, we're for non-binary people, we're now using the third person pronoun they in a singular fashion. Um, and so I decided, like, oh, this might be a really interesting experiment to call Godzilla they. And but then it was my editor who kind of put the kibosh on that and said, copy editor, who said that introduces a lot of confusion into the text, because there are scenes in which Godzilla is interacting with like people who are scurrying around on the ground and stuff like that. If you say they, sometimes it gives the wrong impression that we're talking about the people on the ground rather than Godzilla itself.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, that is totally a very legitimate criticism, I thought. So I'm like, well, what do I do? And I just begin to think, like, when most people, I'd say, most people who aren't necessarily, kaiju fans and don't necessarily know the history of this, when they talk about Godzilla, they almost, as a knee-jerk reaction, say he.
Mhm.
So I figured, well, maybe if I'm going to have to use a gendered pronoun, then probably he would be the better choice.
Mhm.
Um, I and the way that I justified that to myself was that Kayama was thinking about Godzilla as sort of a metaphor for the hydrogen bomb, which was developed
Mhm.
by the American military, which was a hugely patriarchal male institution. So,
Mhm.
if we read Godzilla as kind of this metaphor for this militaristic, thing, then perhaps it's not, completely out of the question to call Godzilla he, because
Yeah.
the male, the industrial military complex that produced the hydrogen bombs was, of course, largely dominated by men. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I will admit, when I first read that part of the essay, I was a little flabbergasted a little bit, but it makes
yeah,
sense when you start getting into it, like, in terms of the way Japanese works, the way the actual text
yeah,
in this is written, and then having to accommodate, the structure and workings of English, because with the confusion, I thought that would totally make
yeah,
sense to me, like, that
yeah.
would create some confusion. But
I
the
but
more
I
I thought.
oh, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't
No,
mean to
I was
interrupt.
just gonna say, it isn't completely unheard of. If you had stuck with it, it's not completely unheard
Mhm.
of, because I have seen, I think it's more in the Heisei and the Millennium movies that get into the
Right.
habit of, at least in the translations, whether it's the dub or in the
Uh-huh.
subtitles, where they do use the pronoun it in
Right.
reference to
Right.
Godzilla. I wasn't the biggest
Right.
fan of that, because, it's like, again, I do tend to think of Godzilla as having, even in those movies that try to take at least a little bit more of a naturalistic approach, I do tend to think of Godzilla as having more personality than, we'll say, like a xenomorph from Alien. Like,
Oh,
I
yeah.
have no
Yeah, yeah,
problem calling a
yeah,
xenomorph an it. Okay.
yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
because that just makes sense to me. But Godzilla
Right.
is different. Godzilla
Yeah,
is unique. A xenomorph is
yeah,
one of many.
yeah.
It,
My understanding is that Toho Studio's official position is that Godzilla is an it, that Godzilla is beyond gender, or Godzilla's gender is not even known. And so,
Yeah, well,
um,
and there has been debate amongst the fandom about exactly what, is Godzilla male or female, or
yeah,
or something in between, maybe.
yeah,
I do think
uh-huh.
most of the fandom does lean toward him being male, but I've heard some interesting arguments for Godzilla being female. you
Sure.
know. It's
You
not
know,
my
and
personal position, but it's interesting.
right, right, right. And one of the things that that always gets left out of this kind of discussion is that in Godzilla's killed at the end of the first movie, right? And so
Mhm.
when he comes back again, or it comes back again, or she
Mhm.
comes back again, or they come back again in
Yeah.
the second film, Gojira no Gyakushu, Godzilla Raids Again, it's a new Godzilla. It's not the same monster,
Mhm.
probably, it doesn't. Yeah, and so like Godzilla seems to be infinitely kind of regenerating, and
Mhm.
there may be multiple Godzillas out there in the world, and
Mhm.
do we even need to kind of conform to one particular pronoun?
Mhm.
I don't know.
That is a very good point. Although I still can't get over the fact that there are still people who get like if you watch Son of Godzilla, that people like still get hung over. It's like, what? I don't understand. How is Minion Godzilla's son and all this? Like, Godzilla didn't lay the egg. He didn't fertilize the egg. He found the egg. He's adopted. This is not hard.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just like, what the heck, guys? So, what kind of whatever on that. But let's talk about
All this is interesting because it shows up like how hung up we are about gender. You know
a
what I mean?
little, yeah, a little bit. Oh, but
Yeah.
but different languages approach these things
Right.
differently.
Yes.
A lot of the romantic languages are incredibly gender. Like just the nouns are
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
conjugated differently depending
Yeah.
on, if you're talking about male or female or whatever, so it's just
Mhm.
a lot of times it's quirks of the different languages, which makes translation work a little bit dicey sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if there's anything in this translation that I'm insecure about, I'll admit it's this choice of pronouns, because I feel like I was forced into the position by the very requirements of English to make a choice,
Yeah.
and I didn't want to do that.
No,
I wish I
I
could have. Like,
totally understand that. You're
yeah,
trying to be as which is one of the things
yeah,
I admire about your work in this is, you're going out of your way to be as respectful to the text as you possibly can, and then
thanks.
you do get backed into these corners where you
Yeah,
have to make a choice, and I
yeah.
think that is why I'm going to say this to to anybody out there, if you haven't bought this book yet, don't don't skip this afterward. This afterward is incredibly valuable
Oh,
because
thanks.
it will, it puts things into perspective, I think. And, learning how you go about translating something like this and hearing about the choices that you have to
Mm,
make, because
yeah.
I don't think people have enough appreciation for the work that has to go into, translating something from one language into another, particularly one that because Japanese is so incredibly different
Mhm.
compared to English. Like, and I'm thinking of this a
Right.
little bit because I just did some machine translation for,
Mm.
I just recorded an episode for the Film Vault on Troll Hunter, which is a Norwegian film.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
so I'm doing some research on some stuff that's related to the movie because that's one of the things I do. It's one of the shticks of the show, is I call it a toku topic, where I research something that either inspired the movie, was going on around the same
Uh-huh.
time, influenced the movie in some form or another. And so I was looking up some stuff for Troll Hunter, and I found this online news article, and it was written in Norwegian. So I, went up to, went up, onto Chrome and just hit translate, and I'm used to it kind of coming out kind of broken, like I've done that for a lot
Uh-huh.
of, like Japanese sources and all that when I've looked at it, and it comes
Uh-huh.
out and you kind of have to like rejigger things in your head to kind of like, wait,
Mhm,
that's not
mhm.
exactly what it means.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
when I did it for this Norwegian, for this Norwegian website, it read perfectly. And I'm
Oh,
like,
okay. Interesting.
I'm like, that just shows you that, just a difference that, these different languages
Yeah,
can make.
yeah,
So I just looked at it, I'm
yeah,
like, okay, apparently Scandinavian languages are closer to English than I thought.
yeah. Yeah, it is really interesting. Each language encodes different information and requires us to, like, it's all languages. Like, for instance, in English, another good example is that whenever we're talking about a noun, we have to specify if it's a singular or plural. There's no way to kind of fudge it, unless you're talking about like a word like sheep, which is the same for the singular and the plural.
Or
You have to use
fish.
the word sheep
So
or fish, yeah.
yeah.
But most nouns, you can't. you either say book or books, and
Mhm.
you can't like kind of make it unclear about whether it's one or more than one. But in Japanese, actually, there's no plural versus singular distinction at all. And so you just put the noun and you determine by context whether it's one or more than one. And
Yeah.
yeah, and so like that's just one little example, but every single time a noun appears in the Japanese language, you have to sort of figure out if it's a singular or plural.
Right.
In most cases, that's very easy, uh, but it can be a little bit complicated at
Yeah.
times, e-
Yeah.
especially like Godzilla when he picking up one person and biting them, or is he picking up a bunch of people and biting their heads off
Yeah.
all at once?
Yeah.
It does make a different impression whether you choose a singular or plural.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, even the word kaiju is the same way.
hmm
And,
hmm
kaiju is a little bit weird because it's basically over the last 10 years has turned into a loan word in English,
yeah, yeah.
which is really interesting. Loan words are fascinating. I listened to a whole podcast where this guy talked about, how loan
Mm,
words work. And it was, it's not just
okay.
in English, it's in multiple languages where this happened. And it's just really interesting to find out how it works and how like there's different levels of loan words, in different languages depending on
Hmm.
how they're used. But
Oh,
one of the sticking points that I've run into is I've been familiar with the word kaiju since before it basically turned into a loan word, and I've gotten used to using the word interchangeably to be singular or plural. But the weird
uh-huh,
thing
uh-huh.
is that I have heard English speakers, and even the movie Pacific Rim does this, if I remember correctly. People say kaiju's.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I never
Yeah,
noticed.
so they take
Huh,
this Japanese word that's
yeah,
now a loan word, and they
yeah.
conjugate it like it's English. And it
Mm.
sounds weird to me every time I hear it, kaijus. I
Oh,
almost never say it. If I catch myself saying it, I'm a little embarrassed.
huh, huh. Interesting, interesting.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. And like I said, it's almost like an acid test to kind of determine how, this is gonna sound a little pretentious and gatekeepery, but kind of like the level of fan that they are, because if they say
okay.
kaijus, I'm like, you're a more recent fan, aren't you?
Oh, interesting, interesting.
I don't know.
Huh,
It's just,
huh.
it's just weird, funny little things like that. But like, anyway, I let's talk about some of the differences that are
Okay,
in this because there's some
sure.
pretty significant ones. And I would say, for what I can remember, I think the most significant difference between Kayama's work and the novel is actually Ogata. Ogata is
Oh,
not as big of a is not as important of a character in Kayama's novelization. Now he does still
right.
do a lot of the same story beats
Mhm,
that you
mhm.
have in the book, but he's not as prominent.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. So, yeah, for fans of the film out there, they all know that Ogata is really he's kind of everything. He's Emiko's love interest. He's one of the main protagonists. He's one of the action heroes. Who does the deep dive at the end of the movie with the oxygen destroyer. Oh no, he's not. He's sorry, he's not there. But like he's right there at the at that
Mhm.
scene. As Dr. Serizawa goes down. So he's there at kind of every moment. But in the book, the stuff that Ogata does is kind of divided up. Some of the action, you're right, like is still done by the Ogata character, but then a bunch of the stuff that he does, for instance, the Emiko love interest is not Ogata in the book; it's Shokichi, who's in the film. Actually, Shokichi is there, but he's a relatively minor character. He's the boy from Odo Island
Mhm.
whose brother Masaji is killed. And he's one of the kind of leaders of the leading taking them around, and kind of guiding them in certain kind of points in the story. But yeah, the major presence in the book version. um,
Mhm.
he really he's Emiko's love interest. They have a backstory in the book. They were evacuated to the mountains of Nagano, near where the Winter Olympics were held, maybe 20 or
Mhm.
30 years ago, out in the mountains of Japan during World War II. They were sent there to kind of keep them, children safe. A lot of children were evacuated into the countryside in World War II. So there's a backstory, there's a kind of, love interest, and all sorts of stuff that happens with Shokichi, who's, barely even a character in the film, only a very minor character.
Hmm.
So that's very
Yeah.
interesting. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that, like, when Kayama was writing this, he really wanted to send the anti-nuclear message to a young generation. He really wanted the young generation to kind of take up the mantle of anti-nuclear activism. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that he's kind of refocused a lot of the kind of moral and emotional conflicts on this young character, um,
Yeah.
who yeah, because he hoped that people would be his young readers would be his audience, and so it makes sense to have a protagonist that's relatively close to the age of his ideal readership.
Right, right. Well, and that's one of the other. This is more of a stylistic difference as opposed to
Hmm.
a story difference, and that is, the anti-nuclear messaging sentiment or whatever in the film is pretty subtle. It's almost not subtle, but it's still
Hmm.
pretty subtle.
Hmm.
This one, it is right there on the surface. It is not
It's right
subtext,
there.
it's text.
Yeah,
And so I don't want to say that Kayama, preaches at his audience, but he certainly makes no secret of,
right.
why, of what the ideas that he's exploring in this book.
Absolutely. And in fact, there's even a little prologue in which the author, Kayama, speaks directly to his readers and says, I have created this story, the story that you now hold in your hands, the story that you're about to read, as an anti-nuclear message. The world, the Cold War world, is creating these horrifying nuclear weapons that have the ability to lay waste to the entire planet, and we can't possibly let that happen. So I hope that as I'm a member of a kind of new anti-nuclear movement, and I hope that you will receive this message. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And so he says that very directly to his audience right at the beginning, and then he launches into the story. Interestingly, in the script that Kayama gave Toho Studios in early 1954 or mid 1954, when he handed over the script, he had some very heavy-handed things that he wanted to be included at the beginning of the movie. Like in fact, he wanted to start out the movie with historical footage, kind of clips
Mhm.
of bombs going off in the Pacific, hydrogen bomb testing. He wanted to show. There was a group of Japanese fishermen. Probably many of your fans have heard about this, who were exposed
Oh,
to
Lucky Dragon
radiation at
number
the
5.
Lucky Dragon number 5, Bikini Atoll, yeah. And one of the guys, one of those fishermen died within the year. That was all front page news every day, in mid to late 1954, right? And that's one of the things that inspired Tanaka to want to make this movie. Kayama was like, we need to put in historical footage of that boat, of the Lucky Dragon number 5. We need to actually show the fishermen's faces themselves. We need to show the protests that erupted across Japan as they realized that the tuna that they're getting out of the Pacific were radioactive because of the hydrogen bomb testing. He wanted all this kind of uh, real life stuff to be included at the beginning of the movie. And if that had been included in the movie, it probably would have changed the tone of the movie pretty
Oh,
drastically, I think.
drastically, yeah.
Yeah. And so, Honda, the director, was like, nuh-uh. We're not gonna do that. That's
No.
that we don't really want to kind of spill over into overt protest film.
Yeah.
It's we need to keep at least it. Um, we need to keep. We need to make sure that people like this film because it's been a very expensive film, and
Yes.
if people feel like they're getting preached at the movie theaters, then they tend to like it a lot less. So,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
he toned that down.
Yeah, yeah, but that's interesting. I do think literature does offer a little bit more space to do some stuff like that and to take some more risks like that. Whereas when you have a film, since a lot of times they tend to be very expensive,
Right.
yeah, studios
Yeah.
are a little more averse to risks
Right.
like that because they are big
Right.
investments. And
Right.
now whether or not it doing something like that is always a bad idea or, or not. I'm not, I think it's very situational. I wasn't bothered by it
Right,
all that
right.
much in this
Mhm.
book, but I think again, I'm a little more
Yeah,
willing to accept it in something like this,
yeah,
and and trust
yeah.
me, I have read books that are far more didactic than
Right,
than
right,
this
of
even
course.
was,
Yeah, yeah,
but
definitely.
yeah. But what's another key difference you would say, between
So there's a really strange plot addition that when I first read it, I was like, "What the hell is this?" There's a little subplot that comes along after Godzilla has made his first appearance in Tokyo, and he's retreated back into the sea. Suddenly, posters start appearing all over Tokyo,
yes,
which are from a cult. And it says, "Oh, our great Lord Godzilla is coming. Prepare yourself for the coming of him." And it seems it kind of has these posters sort of have an apocalyptic tone, and that's nowhere in the movie, nowhere at all. And so when I first encountered this subplot, I was like, what's going on here? In the book, it turns out that they eventually figure out the mystery, and they realize that it's some unscrupulous guy who has a bad criminal background, who's just been trying to stir up trouble. And there's not really any explanation for why he was doing this. So I don't think it's a really well thought out subplot, I'll be honest.
yeah.
I'm not sure. I'll be honest. I don't know what Kayama was wanting to do, what kind of message he was wanting to send with the subplot. But anyway, I mean, the only thing that I can really think of is that Kayama knows from his own experience living through World War II that there are always unscrupulous people who will use um, you know disasters and chaos in order to kind of whip up fervor
Mhm,
amongst the population. There are always
mhm,
people who do kind of weird and unscrupulous things.
mhm,
um, so I my guess is that Kayama was wanting to kind of reflect upon that at least a little bit. But
mhm.
yeah, it's not a subplot that is tremendously important to the main story of the book. And so, yeah, I'm left with more questions about that than I have
Yeah.
answers,
Yeah,
to be quite
yeah,
frank.
that's really interesting because there's something similar to that in Shin Godzilla.
Mm, mm,
Yeah,
mm, yeah,
in Shin Godzilla there and now it's only in one scene, which is astonishing, and I've heard some people criticize the movie, it's like, "Why didn't they lean into this more?" And I will admit that would have been interesting, where
mm,
after Godzilla has appeared and done his initial attack, there are a bunch of people who gather outside of this government building. you know, they look like protesters and they are doing the
uh-huh,
same. They're actually saying like, "Oh, Godzilla is a god and we must worship him," and
yeah, yeah,
and all of this sort of stuff. And it's only in one scene in the comment, and the
uh-huh,
characters comment on it once, and then it never comes up again.
yeah,
And it that's what I think I was going through my head when I was
yeah,
reading this. I'm like, must be something similar.
interesting. Yeah,
Higuchi and Ano must have read this novelization growing up, and they're like, why don't we
yeah,
actually put that in there, but make it an actual thing? But then they don't follow
mhm,
up on it because they're
right,
preoccupied with other stuff, you know.
yeah, yeah,
But I almost wish you would see something like that come up
yeah,
more often. I mean, I wrote a kaiju
it was
short story,
interesting.
and one of it's I wrote a kaiju
Ooh,
short story in one of my short in my first short story collection where that was a big part of the story. It wasn't the most important thing in the story, but it was still the same idea where a kaiju shows up and basically turns a city into a wasteland, and then
uh-huh,
a bunch of the survivors of this disaster, they're stuck in the city, and they basically formed this really bizarre religion,
mm,
worshiping the kaiju and hoping that they can
uh-huh,
placate it. And my characters
yeah,
are, these three siblings who are like, this is all bunk. We need to get out of here. Let's go find mom and dad because their parents were missing, and they're trying to go find their mom and dad. So they're trying to escape this pseudo cult and, you know, get to
oh,
some place where the kaiju isn't, and and
uh-huh.
all that sort of stuff. You would think
I
that. Hmm?
Oh, yeah, no, that's so interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting that you wrote about that.
Mhm.
I when I was thinking about the subplot and the kind of why would people be inspired, by to kind of go in a culty direction when, big monster appears? I thought of the scenes in the classic, anime, Akira.
Mhm.
There's a whole series of scenes about a cult that emerges and says, "Oh, Akira is a new kind of divine sort of presence. We must worship him." And
Mhm.
it's interesting how often this sort of recurs in Japanese kind of apocalyptic fiction. We've just identified three different kind of moments where this happens, and it's interesting that you picked
Mhm.
up on that and carried it forward in your own work.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and
yeah.
it's something that honestly, I think, we're kind of, I know we're veering off a little bit here, but I do want to,
Mhm,
at least take a few minutes to talk about this idea. I think it's
mhm,
something that I think it's a very human response to something,
mhm,
if something that large and powerful
mhm.
comes in and it
Yeah,
completely decimates,
yeah,
your world basically.
yeah.
And
Mhm,
you're going to, regardless of it, whether you're atheist or you had a previous religious affiliation, you're
mhm.
subtly going to be rethinking your whole worldview. And then I think
Yes.
that can lead you to this idea that the only way I can survive, the only way I can have any sort of power
Mhm.
with this thing that has just come in and completely devastated everything, is some sort of, bizarre form of worship. I have to
Right,
placate it. I must sacrifice
right,
to it. And then
right,
it will let up on its, it will let up on what it is doing, or
right,
maybe it will do something beneficial for me,
right.
or something along those lines. It's a bit of a fight or flight
Yeah.
response. It's a form of
Mhm.
panic. And that was
Yeah.
the whole idea. And then I had these, like I said, I had these three characters. They saw right through it
Mhm.
because their
Yeah.
parents told them, it's like, this is all bunk. Don't listen to
Uh-huh,
these people. This
uh-huh,
is,
uh-huh.
this creature is not, this creature's powerful, but it's not a god. All right. It does
Yeah,
not
yeah,
deserve this, this
yeah,
worship that these people are giving
yeah,
it. And if you engage in it, you're just going to be trapped down here. And they hide in a subway system in this city. It's like, you're going
yeah.
to be trapped down here
Interesting.
forever. You
Oof.
have to break out of it. So it's not just a physical escape. It's a mental and even spiritual escape for
Hmm.
these characters.
Interesting. Interesting. Wow. There's one other place in which kind of religiosity is brought up in Godzilla, both in the film and the novelizations. When the characters are going to Odo Island, and before Godzilla has really made his first super dramatic appearance, there's a scene which takes place at a Shinto shrine, and
Mhm.
I think probably most of your listeners are who like Japanese film know, Shinto is the indigenous Japanese religion. It's a kind of simply put, vastly simplifying the story, it's kind of a form of animistic nature worship where
Mhm.
various aspects of nature are kind of personified and seen as having like deities within them. And so Godzilla, this huge monstrous force coming out of the sea, of course he would seem like he's divine in some way. And so
Mhm.
the characters are worshiping at a shrine, and there's this kind of statement about how when Godzilla appeared, to placate Godzilla in the past, sometimes women were sacrificed. Living creatures were sacrificed to placate him. And the implication is that like this all the ritual that we see in the film happening outside this Shinto shrine is it's a ritual kind of designed to appease Godzilla and to make him
Mhm.
calm down a little bit. So yeah, so I mean, yeah, there is a sense that like this not only is happening potentially in the present, but also had happened way, way, way back in the distant past. So
Right, right. And
yeah.
actually, that is I'm glad that you brought that up because you know f- we had basically official confirmation thanks to your translation about how at one point we would have actually seen Godzilla eat something, because in the final
Oh
film we
yeah.
never see him eat anything. And we never see Godzilla really eat anything until the 80s when we find out he feeds on radiation. But
uh,
and this was filmed. There's a photograph of it, of Godzilla eating a cow, and the cow is hanging out of his
yeah.
mouth when he comes
Uh-huh.
over the mountain. And
Uh,
that was deleted from the movie, and it's in this novelization because that was part of Kayama's
yeah.
scenario.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think I read somewhere that Honda felt that it was, like, too graphic. It was just a little bit too upsetting,
Hmm.
and so he decided to remove the bloody cow from the from
Hmm.
Godzilla's mouth. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting because it is, there's hints of at least the bloodiness in the book. And
Yeah.
of course,
Yeah.
a big monster rides across Tokyo. Of course, there's going to be blood involved.
Yeah.
You know, one of the reasons I love Godzilla minus one, I just was a huge fan of that movie, but it was truly terrifying. I think it was the
Yeah.
only Godzilla film I'd really seen, maybe other than Godzilla 1954, which really tried to show the drama of just how awful and terrible and horrific this would be.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. That
but instead
opening
of using,
scene is just,
mhm,
when
oh
we're
my
talking
god,
about, quote unquote eating things, like, yeah, I'm looking at that, and I said this on my episode for the film. I said, like, yeah, I think this was Takashi Yamazaki pushing the envelope as much as possible. It's like, okay, it's like, okay, yeah, the big wigs at the studio say I can't let Godzilla eat people. Fine, but I'm gonna have
uh-huh,
him chomp people and throw them away.
yeah,
Like, I am gonna do it so that, like, Godzilla is literally one, head bob away from breaking the rule.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's dramatic.
Yeah, very, very. But yeah, you are, that is very true. Minus one really does go back in many
Yeah,
ways to
uh-huh,
54.
yeah,
254. I mean,
yeah,
oh man,
yeah,
we could sit here for
yeah,
hours and talk about minus one
yeah.
probably. Oh my gosh. So it's fascinating. But, I do
Just
want to
as
at least
go ahead.
no, I was actually going to transition us to talking at least a
Mhm,
little bit about the Raids Again novelization. I know we spent the bulk of our time
uh-huh,
talking
uh-huh,
about,
yeah,
the original, but I do think we should talk about Raids Again at least a little bit,
okay,
because even the movie is almost treated like an afterthought. It's not,
mhm,
it's not one that people are like, "Oh yeah, Raids Again. I love Raids Again."
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
nobody gets
right,
crazy excited about it. It's almost a footnote. It's like, "Oh yeah,
yeah,
that's the first sequel, and it has the first kaiju fight,
mhm,
and we're
yeah,
done." And then they move
right,
on with their lives. Because
yeah,
admittedly,
right,
King Kong versus Godzilla is a much more exciting sequel, but, there is still this movie sitting in between,
yeah,
54 and that one that, at
yeah,
least should be talked about. So,
agreed.
was that what was so this novelization was published after the
Mhm,
movie came out,
right,
and it was
so,
based on his original scenario. So, what's the background with Raids Again, this Raids Again novelization?
both the Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again novelizations were published together as a single
Mhm.
set, and in 1955, and I think the movie came out in April, if I'm remembering right.
I'll
The
double check.
books came, yeah, the books came out in June, so just a little bit after the movies, but pretty close. So Kayama did have the finished movies, to refer back to, and it seems to me clear that he's when he's writing the novelizations, he's thinking both of his original
Yes.
scenarios as well as the movies, and that's especially clear, I think, in the novelization of Godzilla Raids Again, because like if you watch that movie, there are like scenes where you watch like Godzilla and Anguirus like fighting with Osaka Castle in the background,
Mhm.
and it's very very beautifully framed within the frame of the screen, and when you read the novelization, it's so clear that Kayama is imagining that film version because he describes it like as Godzilla on one side of Osaka Castle and Anguirus on the other side of Castle. It's so clear that he's in his mind. He's replaying that scene that's actually in the film, and I think that actually that's pretty indicative. Like Godzilla Raids Again, the novelization is pretty close to the movie in a lot
It
of
is.
ways. I don't see huge divergences anywhere really in the text. Sometimes he might flesh out a conversation a little bit more, or maybe there's a little bit less detail about some aspect. There's some minor differences, but the plot is really very parallel. But I really, you're totally 100% right, and the appraisal of Godzilla Raids Again. I've very rarely heard people say like, "Ooh, Godzilla Raids Again, woohoo!" Um, but there is something really interesting about this film. It's uh, like in the Cold War period, Japan very clearly felt like it was caught between two massive superpowers, the US and the USSR. And because there were American military troops stationed in Japan, and there are still to this day, there's a very large military presence in Japan. Japan knows, and it knew during the Cold War, that if there was ever any kind of if the Cold War ever got hot and there was a direct military conflict, it would arrive in Japan and Japanese soil. No questions about that.
Mhm.
There was so this kind of sense of sort of being caught between two superpowers. I think it gets translated into this image of Japan sort of being vulnerable while these two superpowers kind of like trample
Mhm.
across it and lay waste to Japan. That was Japan's fear in Cold War times. So I do think it's a really kind of interesting reflection upon the anxieties that Japan was having as a nation at that time.
Right, right, right.
Oh,
And the cold well, the this they were I'm trying to figure out how to say, but even before the Cold War got going, I mean, they were scared of the Soviet Union, for what I understand. Like,
no,
they very specifically, another big motivator for why they surrendered is because they were scared of a Soviet invasion. And if I understand,
it's
it's like
true.
they specifically said, we're surrendering to the Americans
Hmm.
because if we surrender to the Soviets and they come in, it's not going to end well for us. And there are times I think to myself, it's like, man, what a crazy alternate universe would that be where it was the Soviets who occupied Japan instead of the Americans. I mean, like, I will be the first person to tell you, I am by no means a neck deep in this stuff historian. I'm at best an amateur, but so I know that the occupation as it was not all sunshine and rainbows, but if it had been the
Right.
Soviets, Japan wouldn't exist anymore. It would have
It would be
just been
totally
another
different. Yeah.
Soviet state. Their culture would have
Right.
been completely destroyed. And who
Or
knows
changed.
what it
Yeah.
we yeah, or changed it. Who knows what it really what, by the time you
It's
get
hard to
to
imagine.
the early,
Yeah.
late 80s, early 90s when the Soviet Union fell, who knows what the
Yeah.
country would have been like after that.
Yeah. If we want to, if we're doing that little thought experiment, what might have Japan been like? It's interesting to realize that at the end of the Japanese Empire, the Soviets did fight the Japanese in Manchuria, and so there was direct engagement between the USSR and Japan. And so, as a result of that, the Soviet Union took a whole bunch of islands up to the north of Japan.
Mhm.
There was a big island called Sakhalin, which is very, very, very long, and it used to be divided half between the Soviet Union and Japan. It's a very long piece of territory, but Japan lost that to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union just took it, and so now, despite the fact that it had been there've been a huge amount of investment and huge Japanese population there. There you go. I haven't been there, but if you go to that part of the Sakhalin, which used to be part of the Japanese Empire, but now is Russia, like there's barely any trace of the former Japanese past.
Yeah.
Like the very few Japanese remains, a lot of repatriated. The ones who did remain there kind of got incorporated into the new Soviet state, and had very little contact with the Japanese back in the mainland. So yeah, I mean, it is fascinating to think about. Um, well, one more thing about the Godzilla Raids Again, just while we're
Yeah.
talking about this
Yeah.
this story. It's very interesting. I was very surprised when I read this in some of Kayama's essays that he wrote about Godzilla. But when he was asked to write the sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, and come up with a scenario for it, he was at first really resistant. I don't know how much he fought against Toho Studios, but he said that he wasn't happy with the idea at all. And he said the reason for that was because, we killed Godzilla at the end of the movie and movie number one. And so to bring Godzilla back for movie number two seemed just like fakey and cheesy. He
Mhm.
said, I didn't really want to do it. And I, and then, and then, then uh, he also commented, he said, I conceived of Godzilla as a metaphor for the H bomb, and so if we keep on bringing Godzilla back, in a way, it's kind of like we're almost tacitly allowing the H-bomb to continue existing in the world. He would have preferred to have seen the threat of the H-bomb be wiped away. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? So, he wrote Godzilla originally in the first part to be very scary and intimidating and awful, and not to be something loved, you know? So I think that, with the second movie, Godzilla kind of goes to from being sort of the enemy of Japan to sort of half being on Japan's side at times, helping to protect Japan in some ways. And I think you begin to feel like, the metaphor is shifting. The metaphor that
Mhm.
originally intended is going off track. Um, there's an interesting moment that he talks about in one of the essays. He says that he went to a dentist office, and the dentist had a copy of Life magazine, sitting there. I read about this in the afterward, but yeah, and this little boy who was sitting there obviously had no idea who Kayama was, and he picked up the Life magazine with a bunch of pictures of dinosaurs, and he started going like, "Ooh, Godzilla! Ooh, Anguirus!" And he got all excited about it, like, and it was obvious that he loved, Godzilla. He loved Anguirus, and Kayama saw this, and he's like, I really wanted Godzilla to be something, something that was so terrifying that it caused people to think. He didn't intend for kids to kind of fall in love with
Mhm.
Godzilla. And see, so he said, I think I need to call it a night. And so I'm not. If Toho Studios ask me to write another Godzilla movie, I'm going to refuse. No matter how much they ask, no matter how much they beg, I'm not going to write another Godzilla. And then he ends his essay by saying, "I have to admit that even I have started to fall in love with Godzilla," which is like, I think a really, really kind of wonderful thing. I recently came across another essay which I hadn't found before at the time of the interview, where he comments that despite the fact that he kind of cut ties with Toho and the Godzilla franchise after the second movie, Toho Studios continued to invite him every time a new Godzilla movie came out to go and watch it. And so he said that he did that. He wanted to go see the directions that his creation was taking, and so it kind of became a fun thing for him. He said he actually kind of got to the point where he was looking forward to going to see the Godzilla movies that were coming out,
Oh,
you
okay.
know, about every year in the '60s. And so it's clear that he didn't completely hate what Godzilla became,
Right.
but he recognized that it was that there was a shift in the franchise, and I
Right.
think
Right.
any Godzilla watcher will absolutely know that around movie three there's a big turn in the
Oh,
way that the Godzilla franchise goes. So
oh, really big, and yeah,
yeah.
actually you'll probably be interested in this. I'm currently editing an episode that was where I had Danny on, and we talked about Godzilla versus Gigan, and I won't get
Ah.
too much into the weeds, because the
Uh-huh.
episode's coming out. But one of the ideas that we talked about in that is, because we had both read essays and books that that at least hinted at that, and then we really expanded off of the idea, which was Shinichi Sekizawa. At that point, he's like, I'm out of ideas. What am I supposed to do with this? It's the early 70s. It's not the heyday anymore or whatever. And we make the argument that Godzilla versus Gigan, in part, is Sekizawa making a metatextual commentary on what Godzilla had become over the course of 12 movies in 18
Mm,
years,
mm, mm,
where he
mm,
had been turned
mm.
into, had gone from the atomic allegory to this commercialized property,
Mhm, mhm. Yeah.
and and how like the Godzilla tower in that is basically the embodiment of that. Like this is
Mm.
the
Mhm,
this is the commercialized caricature of
mhm.
Godzilla. And what does it do in this movie? One, it's
Yeah.
operated by the bad guys, and they
Mhm,
use it to nearly kill him. And it's
mhm,
only when the
mhm,
tower is destroyed that Godzilla, the quote unquote real Godzilla, is able to
mhm.
save the day. Which, so it's
Uh-huh.
kind of interesting to see,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
even someone like
That's really interesting.
Sekizawa, yeah, so
Hmm.
even someone like Sekizawa who, really stayed in it for the long
Uh-huh.
haul and was working on so many of these movies, even he started noticing some things like that, similar, I guess, to what Kayama was figuring out pretty early
Mm.
on, with movie
Mm.
2. So,
Oh, yeah. Wow, interesting. Well, you've given me some interesting food for thought and,
yeah,
in
yeah,
thinking
for
about that
sure,
movie,
for
but
sure, for
yeah,
sure.
when I saw that Godzilla tower thing for the first time, I was like, "What?"
Yeah. Well, and like I said, the whole idea, is that it's a theme park, at
Yeah,
Disney
yeah.
World that just opened in
Uh-huh,
Florida,
uh-huh.
and they have the, and it's an outside foreign corporation, and like there's a lot of interesting things going on in Godzilla
Yeah.
versus Gigan that that a lot that most Westerners don't pick up on, but I have several scholars that I have to give credit for making me aware of that, the
Nice.
likes of like David Khaled and his wonderful book of
yeah.
essays, talking about that. But anyway, I'm looking at the time. I'm like, we've been at this for nearly 3 hours, and I'm like, dang, and I still have I may have to bring you back on for a part 2 at some point,
That'd be
and
fun.
then that time we'll actually have Danny on. But I do want to make sure we get to this, before we wrap up. And that is, you hinted at it. You've talked about there's some other translations with some kaiju stuff that you're working on, Matango, I'd love to bring you on to talk more about those. But there's one.
Those are all kind of still my dream at this point.
Yeah, your dream
the
at this
dream
point.
that I'm putting together. Yeah.
Yes.
But
you have another translation project that
yes.
When I first started following you, when you're being interviewed on podcasts for, for the Kayama novelizations, and you were hinting, I was like, it's so funny. I feel like I've been tracking this project this entire, over the last, 7 months. And it was like, oh yeah, I want to get this one. You know what? I think I'm going to get that one and I'm going to translate that one. And then it'll be like the next interview. It's like, oh, I'm in the middle of translating that one. I go to Jeff. It's like, oh, it's finished. I just need a publisher. And I'm like,
yeah.
I was like, do it. Do it right. Do it right now. I will buy it day one. The Luminous Fairies and Mothra.
Yeah.
I am stoked about this. When I, when I started, there it is right there. I've seen that cover. I've seen that cover. When I first started doing research on Mothra, I've done an episode on Mothra. So I'm doing all this stuff, and I'm finding I was like, what? It was sort of a book first.
Yeah.
But it's like, is it a novelization or is it an actual original? It's weird. It exists in a really weird spot because it's not quite a novelization, but it's not quite an original book either.
It's a very, very quirky text. And it was written by 3 authors whose names were Shinichiro Nakamura, Takehiko Fukunaga, and Yoshie Hotta. I'm used to saying them in the Japanese order, so I put them in the English order. It was so Toho Studios approached the first of these 3 authors, Nakamura, and said, "Hey, we'd like you to do a kaiju movie with us." And Godzilla was a big success, but and it was Godzilla had by that point sort of moved into the kind of directions where there was a lot of fun elements in it, and kind of the movies were appealing to kids. They decided that they wanted to approach some authors who were famous for writing kind of highbrow literature. And Nakamura said, "Okay, I'll do it if I can bring on 2 other friends and do it as kind of a relay text." So he brought in 2 friends, all of whom were very famous mid-century Japanese writers. I was astonished when I realized who wrote this. I couldn't believe my eyes. So anyway, one author wrote the first part, another author wrote the middle, and another author wrote the ending of the story, and they published it in a magazine. With the understanding that this is going to be turned into a movie. So again, kind of like Kayama did with his Godzilla scenario, way back in 1954, these guys, they write out the story, but like the action scenes, where like Mothra is like flapping, the wings over Tokyo and knocks over Tokyo Tower, and then builds a big cocoon around Tokyo Tower. Those scenes are very truncated in the novel version, because the authors knew that, again, Tsuburaya was going to work his magic in the special effects department and do whatever he wanted with them. So those are very kind of sketchy in this novel. But it is a full novel created before the film was created. And so there's a huge differences. We talked about some differences between Godzilla, the movie, the film, and the novelization. But with this book and the Mothra movie that came after it, there's huge differences. because this was all written without any before Toho
Mhm.
stuck their hands into it. For instance, I think some people might be surprised to find out that there are 4 fairies in this rather
Mhm.
than only 2.
Mhm.
And I think that's probably because it's harder to find quadruplets than it is to
Yeah,
find
yeah. I mean,
twins.
finding twins with the Shobajin, the peanuts, that
Yeah,
was enough of a miracle, yeah, as it
right,
was.
right.
But
They were so good.
yeah, oh, they were
Yeah.
brilliant in that role. But it's also because Shinichi Sekizawa, who wrote the screenplay for that, and for a lot
Mhm.
of people, Mothra, they consider that to be Sekizawa's masterpiece. I do
Yeah,
think it's
yeah,
definitely high up there. I'm a little hesitant to say if that's like his masterpiece, but it's certainly up
yeah,
there. And
yeah.
he liked keeping things simple in
Mhm.
his scripts, so he
Mm,
took that story and he figured out how to boil it down to its most essential
mhm.
elements so as
Yeah.
not to bog down the the audience with a bunch of details, because that is something
Uh-huh.
that it needs to be noted. There's again, it's one of the differences in the mediums.
Mhm.
Books, prose literature it allows more room for some meandering where you can spend a
Oh,
lot of
yeah.
time piling on details and getting into
Uh-huh.
some minutia. A film script has to be efficient. It
It has to
doesn't
be
allow
tight.
for it has to be tight. It doesn't allow for as much of that. And so the idea that he looked at that as like, okay, there's 4 fairies, I'm gonna make it 2. 2 is more
Mhm.
manageable. And then,
Mhm.
they became icons, the
Uh-huh.
Shobajin
Yeah.
did. And,
Yeah.
and then, but then you have later Mothra material that I think might be
Uh-huh.
kind of playing around with the idea a little bit. You get to the Mothra trilogy in the 90s and they
Mhm.
add a 3rd fairy. It's not 4, but they add a 3rd one. Who's like the evil sister, that the other 2 don't like. But
Mm.
then she has a bit of a redemption arc over the course of that trilogy. So
Mm.
I do think that the influence of the novel, certainly it was being felt throughout most incarnations of Mothra, but
Interesting,
that's
yeah.
the biggest difference. Now,
Yeah.
I've heard you say, like at G Fest and some of your other interviews that you're like, yeah, this book is quirky.
It's quirky. It's really strange. And partly it's because of those, the fact that it was sort of, a relay project by 3 different authors. And they each have their different writing styles. So it doesn't feel like the same person wrote it from beginning to end. And in fact, they even in big letters say, okay, this is the part that's written by so and so. They specifically mark out the 3 chunks of the text.
You-
But there's some very interesting things. Like one of the writers of this was fascinated by mythology, and so there's a long kind of tangent in which the one of the character Chujo, was it Chujo or was it the other character? I can't remember. But one of the characters, they go into this long thing about the mythology of Infant
Mhm.
Island and where the Shobijin came from. Where did Mothra come from? What does Mothra mean? Um, and uh, uh, and, yeah, and things like that, things that are completely left out of the movie. And I, as a literary scholar slash nerd, I was just super excited when I read those parts. Like I was like, wow, this is nowhere in the movie, and how cool
Mhm.
is it? So yeah,
Yeah,
it's
well, and I do think that's a testament to Sekizawa as a screenwriter because when I watch Mothra, even
mhm.
before I was aware of that,
Mhm.
I never thought to myself, I was like, well, I wish I knew where all of this came from. I'm not.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, 12-inch fairies, big moth, worshipped as a goddess. I'm just like, I just
Yeah.
roll with it and I go. I don't need to know
Yeah.
where it all comes from,
Uh-huh.
because I'm invested in the story of
Mhm.
that moment.
Yeah.
So I do
Yeah.
think Sekizawa was wise in saying like, okay, we don't need this big exposition dump. We can take
Yeah.
that out. We can focus on what's
Right.
going on right here. And
Uh-huh.
but like I said, a book allows you to do that.
Yeah.
You can get into that. And I'm fascinated
Yeah.
to read this. I'm aware of it and kind of in summary, but to actually be able to read it and see what this grand I it's a grand piece of mythology.
Yeah, yeah, it was fun. I read that little the passage. I think it's a couple pages long about the mythology at G Fest, and I got so many comments afterward. People were like, "Wow, that was so much fun!"
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I hope
yeah,
that
yeah.
people look forward to it. Yeah, I finished the translation. I haven't finished an afterword yet, but and we've secured the rights. I was at G Fest when I got the final confirmation that we secured the rights from all
Yeah.
three of the writers to move forward. So
Oh,
I don't
yeah.
have a specific timeline. I don't know exactly when it's going to hit the bookshelves, but it will be coming.
Oh,
Yeah.
you
Is it?
yeah,
Would it be
you'll
okay to?
it'll like I said, day one purchase for me. I'll probably have you
Yay!
back on the show actually to talk
Oh,
about it in
nice.
more detail,
Oh, that'd be
you know?
fun. Would it be
Because
okay to? Oh, go ahead.
no,
I was going to
I'm
ask.
just saying, like, I'm really excited.
Oh, thanks. Would it be okay to share a passage
Oh,
with
no, I
anyone
please.
who's stayed here and listened with us all this time?
No, no,
Um,
please.
okay. Let me find. Let me bring up my translation here. Okay. I was thinking that I might read a uh, a passage towards the beginning of the text where Chujo is talking about his experiences. So he's in at this point in the story, he's just arrived at Infant Island. They've gone out on the first day of exploration, and after that, he gets attacked by vines which suck his blood,
The vampire
and then
vines, yep.
vampire vines, that's right. And he's carried back, is treated, and then he's thinking about going out the next day. So this is a scene where he goes out the next day and encounters the Shobijin, the little fairies, for the second time. So here we go. The sky was bright overhead as a siren went off, echoing across the landscape. Thinking that another colleague must have been caught by the blood-sucking plants, the scientists on the seashore rushed towards the noise. Chujo and Harada were in front of the flowers from the day before. This time, Harada was the one standing as still as a statue. Chujo called out to all the approaching scientists, "Look, I've got proof of the little women!" Everyone looked in the direction he indicated. Standing on the ground was a tiny little woman looking up at them all. She was just over 60 centimeters tall, and her chest and hips were those of a beautiful woman, but as she looked around at the gathered crew members, her tiny eyes seemed to flash with a mysterious brightness.
Mhm.
My experiences yesterday led me to guess that these beautiful little women are extremely responsive to sound, so I tried using my siren. And look, the experiment worked. She showed up just like before, and here she is. You can't doubt me anymore. Everyone, everyone looked down in amazement at her. Indeed, she was a marvel of nature. Suddenly, the little beauty, the Shobijin, began to speak. Well, perhaps speak isn't exactly the right word. What she did was closer to singing. A clear musical voice began to flow from her tiny mouth, a voice completely unlike any that had ever emerged from human vocal cords before. And as she sang, her arms and legs began to move as if dancing in time to her words. Chujo listened attentively to the melody and followed the movements of her body. Without shifting his eyes from her, he said, "Her language doesn't fit into any language family. It's completely its own thing. It just has a subject and a predicate. It's less like a language than some sort of code. It seems like she's trying to ask us whether or not there'll be any more hydrogen bomb tests." She stopped singing. I don't know how they figured that out, but she stopped singing, looked at Chujo, and gave a smile. Her expression, so full of trust, filled his heart with an indescribable feeling of happiness. Even without really thinking about it, he extended his hand toward her. Right then, he heard someone speak up behind him. "Raf," the expedition leader said with obvious irritation in his voice, "Chujo, tell her that the island no longer has any value as a testing ground." Chujo just silently shook his head, sorry that he didn't know how to translate the message into a melody like hers. But a joyful expression rose to her tiny face. Chujo nodded at her over and over, overjoyed that he'd been able to communicate with her after all. She raised one hand and tried to dash away. Right then, Nelson jumped in front of her. With a strong, muscular arm, he scooped her up. "What are you doing?" Chujo clamped his hand down on Nelson's shoulder in surprise. "Don't be so rough." Nelson turned and gave him a scornful look. "We're here to collect materials and data. She's a valuable find." She wriggled around in Nelson's arms and looked up at his face. She seemed to have guessed that he might try to grab her. Suddenly, she raised a sharp cry, which once again took the form of a magnificent song. Her voice evoked a strange reaction in everyone, making them feel as if they were going to be absorbed into the hot sky above. Someone shouted, "The natives!" A group of dark-skinned, half-naked men and women began to appear from the tall grass one by one. They wore bloodthirsty expressions on their faces. Ruff, the expedition leader, shouted, "Nelson, let her go! You're putting us in danger!" Nelson made an exasperated sound, but he set the tiny women back on the ground. Immediately, the natives gathered around the Shobijin, and an instant later, they disappeared into the grass once again. Nelson glared back and forth at Ruff and Chujo. "Why were you so frightened? We've got pistols and rifles!" His eyes were burning with ugly fervor. "Nelson, there's no need for violence," Chujo shouted. "You're not on safari. We're not shooting wild animals in Africa. Those were human beings, just the same as you and me." "Huh, human beings, you say?" Nelson held up his hands and sneered at them. "Are you saying that these tiny little creatures are human too? If you think that little female's human, I'd like to see you try and marry her." A derisive smile rose to his face. "Just think, a Jap and a lady dwarf." In a sharp voice, Raph shut him down. "Cut it out. You're being stupid. Go ahead and debate things scientifically, but I'm not going to put up with such behavior." Anyway, I'll stop there. But
Oh, that
it
sounds
gives you,
so great.
it's funny, like it gives you a sense about how there's kind of colonial, post-colonial
Oh,
tension going on. There's a racial tension going on here. There's all kinds of questions are how human are the Shobijin?
mhm.
These are all fascinating questions, I think. So
Oh, that was
yeah,
so good. I'm like, oh, man,
cool.
I need this book in my life.
Right on,
Oh,
right on.
I am very excited for this. And like I said,
Oh, thanks.
I'll happily bring you back on to talk
You know,
about
one of
this.
the I gotta say, one of the things that's been really delightful is I've been working on the translation of this book, and when I mention it to people, I've been so surprised and overwhelmed by how many people say to me, honestly, Mothra is like my favorite of all the kaiju. Like I even love Mothra more than Godzilla. I've been stunned at how many times I've heard that, and I didn't realize that Mothra was such a gigantic favorite for so many people. So
Mhm.
it is exciting to bring this out.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm really looking forward to it. And that talking about that and all the stuff attached to Mothra because you are right. Mothra's a big deal for a lot of people, and then there's
Yeah.
a pretty vocal contingent of the fandom that
Hmm.
does not like Mothra.
Yeah.
you know,
Okay.
but which is unfortunate for them, but yeah, but
I think it's great fun.
so we can start unpacking that and a lot of other just
Mhm.
really cool things. Given the fact that we just crossed the 3 hour mark, and
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of your time as much as possible. I know the school year just started. I know
Yeah.
Labor Day is coming up, so you get a little bit of a breather. But I've taught at the college level. I know what that can be like. So, I want to be as mindful of your time as I can be.
Oh,
And as
thanks.
much as I would love to talk to you about like other Japanese film, I hinted at the beginning, I did make a list, we hinted at some of them, and talked about them briefly throughout our conversation. I think I'm going to save that for a potential follow-up
Yeah. Yeah.
conversation
Let's talk again. Yeah.
because we spent as much time as we have on what we've
Mhm.
talked about. But I do want to
Yeah.
take what
It's
I'm
been a lot of fun.
surprised. Yeah, I'm surprised we didn't get more comments in the chat. I'm a little disappointed that we
Okay.
didn't, but I do want to highlight, the comments that we did get here just really quick, and then we'll start wrapping things up here. But we had my friend Drew Dodgen from the Cellcast, jumped in pretty early on. He just said good evening,
Yay.
and then we had, let me see, now the chat's starting to move a little bit. We had the awesome Shark. Hi. Yeah, because he
Hi.
says hi there. Hi there. And then we had Helmi Abdit. I hope I said that correctly. I say that a lot on the show, when all these foreign names or words pop up, and it doesn't matter what language it is. I'm just like, I hope I said that right. And then I just move on. I've been trying to practice some of my, Japanese pronunciation, with all the titles
Mm.
and such that I've been having to read. We also were visited briefly, at least in the chat, by Donnie Winter, who says, two of my favorite human beings, Well, thank you, Donnie. I'm very flattered
Thank you.
actually to hear that. And then Elijah dropped in
Ah,
to leave us a comment. He says, just popping in here to say hello. It's great to see Jeffrey's amazing work still getting the recognition it deserves. Can't wait to see many amazing kaiju work from you, Jeffrey. Hope all is well.
thanks,
What?
Elijah.
Yeah, well, and yeah,
Appreciate
I
it.
mean, you heard it here first, I think, where you say like, "I'm going to put together a little collection for all of you," and yeah, I'm very excited about that. So then we have Tim Bartis, is that right? Yeah, Bartis. Okay, it's a. I was like, is that an A or an O? I'm trying to make sure I see that correctly because
Yeah,
I don't have a full screen
looks
here.
right.
Yeah, he says, "Thank you, Dr. Engels and Nathan, for providing such an intellectually stimulating conversation. Thank you very much." And then he left us a second comment that
Mm.
says, when will the Mothra book be available for purchase, and who will be the publisher? That is a very good question.
So the second half, I'll answer first. It will be University of Minnesota Press, which did the Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again translation. They were such good advocates for this book, and they believed in it right from the start. So I'm so happy that they're interested in publishing the Mothra book. I don't have a specific production timetable right now, so I think that there's some details to be worked out there. But yeah, and I'm working on the afterword to it right now. So
Mhm.
I
It
finished the translation. So the copy editing, the production of the book, and so on.
right.
Typically, I think that takes around a year or so.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're hoping to. I'm hoping to wrap up my work on it fairly soon and put it all in the publisher's hands.
Right,
But I
right,
can't quite predict exactly what month it's going to be available. So
right,
stay tuned.
right. Yeah, did you and we don't have to get into all the details for it now, obviously, we should save that for later and, it's 3 hours. But, did you have to go through Toho for this one? I think because I think the right situation was a little bit different with this one, from what.
That's right. Yeah, I haven't heard all the stories because I left a lot of this up to the agent in Japan that I was working with. So he's done the kind of nitty gritty work on the ground, but he's gone to each of the estates of the three writers who worked on Mothra, and we didn't go through Toho Studios. I think it would be necessary to go through Toho Studios probably if we were to translate the script that Serizawa, adapted from the novel. Actually, the book that I worked from in doing my translation, it's this book,
Mhm.
which is actually long out of print and super hard to find in Japan. It's like a collector's item now. It contains all the versions of it contains two different versions of Serizawa's draft
Mm.
of it, and so if you read Japanese and you're interested in seeing like all the iterations of the story, it's all preserved right here in this wonderful book. So, yeah, super exciting.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we do have a couple more quick comments. I'm going to be
Mhm.
from one person, Ben Nero. He's one of my friends actually at Wild Hunt Press, which is a small
Oh,
publisher. He says, "You have me. Wild Hunt Press says hi." And
oh,
then
yay!
and then he says, "And Wild Hunt Press fully supports your great podcast and I will be buying Jeffrey's book."
Oh, well, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really nice to know about editors and people at presses who are interested in kaiju. So
Well, yeah, yeah.
now that I know Wild Hunt Press,
Yeah,
I'll
Wild
look
Hunt
you up.
Press. There's another one that does some kaiju work that I haven't worked with them. I forget what they're called. They have their name is a reference to like blades and edges. I can't remember what it's called. I'll
Hmm.
probably get told in the comments by Ben Nero because I know he's friends with them. But I've done work with them, and they're a small publishing house, and they aren't all kaiju, but they do a lot of kaiju work. And it's funny, when you're talking about how Luminous Fairies and Mothra was written, I have actually written a kaiju book just like that.
Oh, hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's self-published right now, but I'm in the middle of writing a sequel to it because I had a lot of demand for a sequel. And
Hmm.
I pitched it to Wild Hunt, the sequel, and they're interested. And they said, "Hey, and we'll pick up the first one for you too if you want." I'm like,
Ooh,
okay,
wonderful.
but it was written the similar way, but it's about 30,000 words, and then me and two of my friends, we each took turns writing about 10,000 over the course of a couple of months, and
Oh,
then after a
how
year,
fun.
we had a complete novel, and
Mm,
I did the same thing. Actually, in mine, I actually just demarked each section. I just said, like, part 1 by Nathan Marchand, part 2 by Natasha Hayden, and then just went from
mhm,
there. I didn't feel the need to try
mm,
to edit them together to make them match stylistically. I had
mhm,
another
mm,
now
mm,
this I had another book that was part of that project that required that because the contributions were very lopsided. It was like 8,000 from the first guy, 2,000 from the second, and the rest from me, which is like 20K.
mm,
So
mhm,
that one had to be edited together to make it fit stylistically. That was published
mhm,
by Wild
mhm,
Hunt. It was a
mm,
sword and
mhm,
sorcery story.
mhm.
So yeah. So yeah, they're good people. I can vouch for them.
Great,
We do
great.
have another comment. It said,
Oh,
Jeffrey, will there be an English translation for the novel that Atragon is based on? Here's the thing, Ben. There already is. I
yeah.
was one of the ones I
Um,
was going to bring up. The Undersea
oh,
Warship. I'll mention it
yeah.
briefly. The Undersea Warship by Shunro, right? Yeah,
Shunno
Shunro
Oshikawa. That's right.
Oshikawa.
Mhm.
It is already available to purchase. It was translated by Shelley Marshall, from what
Yeah,
I
someone
saw on.
who I
Yeah,
don't know. Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that book was actually written a long time ago, long before the movie. It was I don't know the
1899, if I
yeah,
remember correctly.
1890s, right, right, 1899. Okay, it's a yeah that book it was influenced by Jules Verne, the French sci-fi kind of adventure person. He very inspired by him, and that book was a massive bestseller. It influenced entire generations of young Japanese male readers. So it was a really, really influential book. I took a brief look at the translation, and uh, yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah, I think it's relatively well done, and
Mhm.
yeah, so it is out
Yeah.
there, and I think it's available as like a Kindle book for just a few
Yeah,
dollars or something.
and actually, give me a second here. Let's see. Do I? No, I don't have it. I don't have. No, I don't have it pulled up, but it is on Amazon.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
can find you can actually get it on Amazon. I
Mhm.
found it on the list. Oh, and here he told me it's Severed Press. That was the other one.
Mhm. Mhm.
That was
Okay.
the other one. Yeah. Oh, look at Ben doing a bunch of shameless self promotion here. Wild Hunt Press has published Attack of the Kaiju Volume 2 and is now working on a new edition of Volume 1 and Volume 3. They're coming soon. Thank you. Yeah. I contributed to that anthology, Volume 2,
Nice.
actually. So,
Nice.
yeah.
Look
So,
forward to
oh,
reading it.
geez. He's throwing more comments at us. The Raventail Publications also publishes kaiju literature. Okay, that's good to know for future reference. Even though I don't plan on leaving Wild Hunt anytime soon, but it's just good to know for future reference.
Good. Good.
So, yeah, but
Excellent.
what you're doing here is that's a little bit different, but yeah. But yeah, we'll talk. I have the Undersea Warship on my list to purchase and read
Mhm.
eventually. I am a massive fan of Atragon, but I do
Mhm.
know that the movie is very different from the book, from what I
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
Because the book, the biggest difference being, and I'll just say this, and then we'll start closing up. But the book, from my understanding, having not read it yet, so this may or may not be accurate. I'm not entirely sure, but I've been told that the book is incredibly nationalistic in that very old
Yes.
Imperial
Yes.
Japan sort of way,
Yes.
whereas the
Mhm.
movie is very anti-imperialism,
Mhm. Right.
which is
Right.
what makes it
Yeah.
such a fascinating story.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
That writer Oshikawa was huge, and one of the reasons he was so big was I think he played into kind of the ideological demands of his time. And
Yeah, for sure, for sure. All right, like I said, we're 3 hours and 12 minutes. Oh, 13. We just hit 3 hours and 13. So, really quick, you do your shameless self-promotion because it's a trademark of the Monster Island Film Vault. Real quick. We've been doing a lot of it this entire time, but let people know where they can find you, or
oh,
any
okay.
besides Luminous Fairies, like if there's any other project, and just anything you want to want the people to know about.
Gosh. I feel like I've already talked so much about various things. Yeah, there's another book. If I can put in a little small plug for it, it's one of the books that I translated that I really care about a great deal. It's called The Book of the Dead, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a very 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 big classic of 20th century Japanese literature. It's one of the strangest books I've ever read in my life. It's so bizarre and so quirky. It's about a guy who's been dead for a long period of time, and through a accidental mistaken spell, he's brought back to life in his tomb, and is unable to escape. So his soul begins to wander across the countryside in 8th century Japan, more than a millennium ago. It's a wild, weird story. But it's called The Book of the Dead, written by a Japanese writer with the last name of Orikuchi. Um, that was a project that took me basically 3 years, because it was so complex and involved, and I just got so obsessed with it in my nerdy literary way that
Mm-hmm.
I really would love it if some people thought that they might be interested to take a look at it.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely. I promise you, it will be like any other book uh, that you've ever read.
Right. Right.
So anyway, that was one of my recent projects that I care
Okay.
about a
Okay.
lot.
Any
Yeah.
socials that you want to
Oh
promote
yeah.
before? Yeah.
I'll be honest that I've fallen off of X
Mm,
a little bit in recent years. But yeah, uh, I Facebook is a good way to contact me, and
mm-hmm.
I'm always putting up information about new publications and stuff there.
Mm-hmm.
Although I have to admit, I haven't been having so much fun writing and translating these days that I'm putting all of my writing energy more into those projects than I am on social media right
As you
now.
should.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you should. And I do suppose if people wanted to go digging, because the way I got a hold of you is I went on to the what is it?
Oh
University of
yeah, I'm
West
right.
Michigan
I'm
University.
totally
I went there and
right.
I found your contact info
Yeah,
there and got a hold of you that
yeah,
way.
yeah. I'm pretty easy to find online. Yeah,
Yeah.
if you just type in my name, Jeffrey Angles,
Mhm.
my profile at Western Michigan will come up right away. So yeah, and
Okay.
I love to hear from people who are kaiju fans out there like me,
Mhm.
and who are happy to to share their passion for some kaiju project.
Yeah.
I
Well,
love that. So
it has been a pleasure having you on the show. I'm sad
thank
Danny
you.
wasn't with us, but maybe we'll do a part
No,
2.
it's great.
And
No, we
I'll make
had a
sure
blast.
I'll just make sure Danny has no excuse and he's just going to be on, and then we can nerd out about, some of the other things that we didn't quite get to tonight, cuz I would love to do a follow up
Yeah,
with you. I think I told you at G Fest
cool.
was like I could sit around and
Yeah.
talk with you for hours about kaiju and literature and teaching
uh,
English and like all of these things. They're,
I'd love
you
it.
know,
Yeah, that'd be a
yeah,
lot of fun.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
that'll, like I
This has
said,
been great.
I'll keep you posted. I'll let you breathe a little bit and go be a professor for a little
All right.
while, because the classes just started and and stuff like that. So if anybody, just to do quick plugs right here, if anyone wants to get a hold of me as part of the podcast, if you listen to the audio version, just listen to the credits. Check out my author website, nathanjsmarchand.com. Listen to me on the Scyther Inc. Productions audio dramas, both Power Rangers and X-Men. And soon, I think as of this weekend, I'll be making my debut on the Avengers audio drama as the Human Torch, which is going to be
Nice.
exciting. I think we're going to try to make that into a party. Basically, the guy who runs the show is trying to get the cast together on Saturday and have like a little meetup and talk with people and things like that. So that should be tons of fun. And keep an eye on my author website to get learn to keep track of all of the book projects that I'll be involved in. I'm hoping to have potentially up to 3, maybe even 4 new books in print, including hopefully a comic in the
Mm.
coming, in the coming year. And I am working on a full audio drama episode for Scyther. So that should be fun. Anyway, thank you once again, Jeffrey, for joining me tonight. And I look forward
Sure.
to, hearing, talking with you some more and hopefully seeing you at G Fest again next year, except this time
Yeah.
perhaps as an attendee instead of a guest.
Cool.
Because
All right.
we
Well,
would
thank you
love to
so
have
much.
you. Mhm.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks.